At Arthur Street School she appeared at first to be coping with the work, in spite of continuing reservations about whether she wanted to make a career in teaching. She was at ease in the company of her class of over 38 and 9-year-olds and stimulated by the daily contact with them. She heard tables and reading in People of Other Lands, talked in a casual way about Robert Bruce and the Spider and King Alfred and the Cakes, and spent all dinner hour putting stars on neat work. Point 22 She reveled especially in the children's art and in their poetry, for they wrote poetry and stories almost every day, and these, with the paintings, I pinned around the walls for everybody to enjoy. Point 23. Where she failed utterly was in her inability to participate in the corporate life of the school. Her cousin Iona Livingston and a teacher's college contemporary, Norma Majeur, were also on the staff at Arthur Street and valued it highly as a well-run school. They got on with each other, and with other staff. They simply never saw Janet and gained the impression that she was having trouble fitting into. Point 24. According to Janet's own recollection, my timidity among people, especially among those who might be asked to judge and comment on my performance as a teacher, led to my spending free time alone. Too timid to go to morning and afternoon tea with a room full of teachers, I made excuses about having work to do in the classroom, aware that I was going against all the instructions about the need to mix in adult company, take part in social events and discussions with other teachers and parents, and that morning tea in the teacher's room was an almost sacred ritual. 25. The effort required daily to resist contact with other staff was considerable and one major source of stress in her life. The other, growing larger by the day, was her old fear of being judged and found wanting. She did develop a technique to keep the headmaster, Mr. C.D. Gilling, at bay. She invented a serial story which I could continue whenever I heard the steps of authority approaching along the corridor, so that a visit by the headmaster to a class sitting rapt with attention might prove my ability as a teacher. Point 26 It was her hope that she could contrive a similar ploy when the dreaded inspector arrived. But as the year advanced she doubted her capacity to sustain this kind of pretense. She became progressively more apprehensive and depressed. I felt completely isolated, she would write subsequently. I knew no one to confide in, to get advice from, and there was nowhere I could go. If she had failed her inspection, as she was sure she would, what would become of her? What, in all the world, could I do to earn my living and still live as myself, as I knew myself to be? Temporary masks, I knew, had their place. Everyone was wearing them. They were the human rage. But not masks cemented in place until the wearer could not breathe and was eventually suffocated. 27. Janet's major relief from this unhappiness, and one that was sufficiently invigorating to renew her stamina for teaching, was her university psychology lectures and laboratory sessions which she attended 2 evenings a week and on Saturday mornings. She was engaged by the subject itself, which offered a range of theories to explain the origins and vagaries of human behavior, by the laboratory experiments, and especially by her principal teacher, a fresh-faced young graduate from Victoria University, 23-year-old junior lecturer John Money, whom she nicknamed Ash, after the fair-haired Ashley Wilkes, played by Leslie Howard, in the film Gone with the Wind. Although former servicemen had begun to return to university by 1945, the war was not over and there was still a marked shortage of young men among both the university staff and students. Those who were there, especially staff, tended to be the subject of rumor, speculation and fantasy, especially if they were good-looking. John Money was not only good-looking, he was intelligent, forthright and charming. Point 28, some of the women swooned over Ash, Janet reported. She was one of them. When he chanced to smile at her, she said later, she was happy for days. When he failed to notice her, she was melancholic. Point 29. Money's appeal for Janet was heightened by the fact that he was musical. He played the piano sufficiently well to have considered a career as a musician. The topic of his master's thesis had been creative endeavor in musical composition. Shortly after his arrival at Otago University at the beginning of 1945, he had instigated weekly lunchtime sessions in musical appreciation in the gramophone studio of the music department. Janet began to attend these sessions, rushing to and from Arthur Street in order to do so. One day when she arrived early she was transfixed to come upon Money playing the piano in the studio, up and down the keys in a flourish and swoop like a concert pianist, marshalling the notes together in a traveling force going somewhere. Point 30 Later that same day Money played a record of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, Der Pathetic, the first sustained piece of classical music Janet had listened to. As a consequence of both experiences, the music room became another place where she felt at home. 31 Janet also began to attend lunchtime and evening concerts in the Dunedin Town Hall, often in the company of her former fellow teacher's college student, Sheila Trail, who was working out her probationary year at Ravensbourne School between Dunedin and Port Chalmers. "I didn't know not to clap at the end of the first movement," Trail wrote later. But Janet didn't clap at all, not even at the end. She just sat there in her own world, overwhelmed. This behavior, to Trail, seemed perfectly natural. What was less acceptable, in Trail's view, was the fact that Janet spoke of a developing passion for John Money, whom she referred to as HCF, for highest common factor. We dared not breathe the real names of the heroes we idealized. More than that, the passion seemed to extend to the subject of psychology itself, which Trail was inclined to dismiss as a lot of nonsense. Janet told her that she wanted to get to the bottom of the human mind, and, more alarmingly, to delve into abnormal psychology. She used to talk of going mad, and what it would be like, just as she talked of how it would feel, in the words of the song, to done get drunk. 32. In July 1945, everything that preoccupied Janet, her sense of isolation, the tension she experienced at school, her apprehension about the future, her pash on John Money, her flirtation with the notion of going mad, all combined to produce a crisis. A new lecturer recently discharged from the Air Force, Peter McKellar, took over the laboratory classes on Saturday mornings, temporarily as it turned out, but Janet did not know that at the time. This development, which appeared to erase her weekend contact with Money and hence her only source of pleasure and replenishment at that time of the week, coincided with a particularly unhappy week at school. She decided to activate another notion that until this time she had merely flirted with: she would attempt suicide. On the evening of the same Saturday that Money was absent from the laboratory, her landlady was away for the weekend. Janet tidied her room, organized her possessions and, with the help of several glasses of water, swallowed a packet of aspirin. "I lay down in bed to die, certain that I would die. My desperation was extreme." 33 She did not die, however. She woke the next day, near noon, with a roaring in my ears and my nose bleeding. My first thought was not even a thought, it was a feeling of wonder and delight and thankfulness that I was alive. I staggered from my bed and looked at myself in the mirror. My face was a dusky red. I began to vomit again and again. At last my nose stopped bleeding but the roaring in my ears continued. 34 Janet recovered sufficiently to face her landlady that evening and to return to school the following day, and generally to behave as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The following month was especially eventful. The war ended with the surrender of Japan on August 14th. Janet came of age by turning 21 on August 28th, and, in the August holiday break between the second and third school terms, she wrote her first adult story for publication, University Entrance, which she sent to the New Zealand Listener. She also wrote an autobiographical assignment for John Money's course. This provided her with a means to hint at her distress and to discuss her difficulties, which until now she had kept resolutely to herself. And she would achieve these objectives by forming a more intimate association with Money than she had achieved up to this time. John Money was well aware of Frame by August 1945. "I already had a strong premonition of her literary capability because she didn't write up the psychology lab experiments in the routine way," he recalled. Each one was done as a parable, with birds or other animals acting the role of the investigator, the experimenter and the observer. They were all brilliantly done, and she had the principles 100% correct. Whereas other people I consulted would have failed her for not obeying instructions, I gave her an A+ for understanding what the experiments were about. 35. Money set the autobiographical assignment in August 1945. Members of the class were to record the major and most influential events in their own lives. Frame's essay summarized her life to the end of her high school years. Then she added, as if in afterthought, "Perhaps I should mention a recent attempt at suicide." She described what had occurred the previous month and, to make the attempt more impressive, used the clinical term for aspirin, acetylsalicylic acid. 36. Money, as Frame would have anticipated, called her to his office shortly after the beginning of the third term, supposedly to discuss the manner in which she had dealt with the assignment. In fact, the confession of the suicide attempt had alarmed him, and his concern for her well-being went beyond his role as a lecturer in psychology. Earlier in the year, in the absence of any kind of student health service, Money and his colleague Peter McKellar had decided to advertise clinics, at which they would make themselves available to students to discuss problems of a psychological or vocational nature. Telling his mother in May 1945 about this additional responsibility, Money had written, "I hope we will eventually get on to more interesting problems of personality maladjustment. That is quite a complicated business. One has to be very cautious not to make any mistakes." 37 The student Money was about to counsel in September 1945 would provide precisely the kinds of problems that he would find interesting, and, for a 24-year-old psychologist with no clinical training or experience, challengingly and hazardously complicated. Frame came to Money's office in the attic of one of the university's old ivy-covered professorial houses on September 19th. She told him that she had walked out of her classroom at Arthur Street the previous week as the inspector walked in. This was in part a consequence of her deep fear of being judged, but it was related, she said, to the fact that she was even more unconfident than usual because Money had passed her in the street the previous day without recognizing her. She said she had difficulty teaching because of her bright ideas flitting through her mind, in the nature of metaphors which could be remembered for future use in writing. Frame also told Money of her deep devotion to literature, and indicated it was in that direction that she would prefer to make a career. She had no wish to return to teaching, but had told her headmaster by telephone that she would produce a medical certificate to explain her sudden departure from school and continuing absence. Now she was additionally anxious about how to extricate herself when she had in fact no such certificate. 38. To Frame's intense relief, John Money became fully engaged by her predicament and took control. He invited her back for further counseling sessions over the next 2 days, mainly in an attempt to persuade her that she really wanted to live, that she wanted to create, and that she wanted to avoid the loneliness that she now imposed upon herself. He then had telephone conversations with the Arthur Street headmaster, Mr. Gilling, and the education board inspector, a Mr. Hunter. Each told him that they were extremely perplexed about what had occurred, but also very sympathetic. 39. On September 24th, Money escorted Frame to a meeting at Hunter's office. The inspector proposed that she complete her probationary year at Arthur Street, but that at the end of it he withhold her certificate on the ground that she was unhappy about teaching and therefore unsuited to it. This would enable Frame to leave the profession without penalty. In the meantime, Hunter would speak to his friend, Donald Cameron, mayor of Dunedin, about finding Frame an alternative job as a librarian, in recognition of her interest in literature. This proposed resolution, Money recorded, seemed generally satisfactory. 40 While Frame was working out the years, she would continue to have weekly counseling sessions with the psychology lecturer, or to see him more frequently if she felt she needed to. While Frame was not overjoyed at the prospect of returning to the classroom, at least she could envisage an end to what had come to seem more like a penal sentence than a vocation. And she did now have the concentrated attention of the man with whom she was obsessed and guaranteed access to him on a regular basis. It is probable that already some of the so-called symptoms that she discussed with him, such as the intensity of the ideas flashing through her mind and distracting her from teaching, were manufactured in order to enlarge and retain his interest. She was to confess to him 18 months later that her contact with him had come about through scheming. "I scheme more than you realize." 41 But at the outset, Money had no inkling of this. For 2 weeks the compromise arrangement appeared to work. Then, on October 11th, Money rang Arthur Street School and left a message to say that he was unable to see Frame as scheduled that afternoon, Friday, because he was leaving town early to go skiing for the weekend. He asked her to come the following Monday afternoon instead. At mid-morning, Frame rang him from a public telephone box to say that she had walked out of school again and was calling to say goodbye to him. She informed me that she was not going to see me again, ever. Nor was she going to see anybody else again, ever. Alarmed, Money consulted his head of department, Henry Ferguson, then rang the police. At his request, a police car collected Frame from the vicinity of the telephone box and brought her to his office. I began an interview with her that lasted about 1.5 hours. We got nowhere. She continually reasserted her need to die, and that there was no other escape. Money, committed to his 2 days away, arranged for the police to collect Frame and to contact Isabel and her parents so that she would not be alone for the weekend. As a result, George Frame came down from Oamaru. 42. On the Monday, somewhat to Money's surprise, Frame turned up for her rescheduled appointment. Lying on the couch in his office, relaxed by what he called hypnotic chatter, she gave an explanation of what she believed had been going on. Money took notes. As I would know, Frame told him, all young people were likely to have infatuations. I had been the object of her passion since the beginning of the year. Only she, and possibly her sister and friend, Sheila Trail, knew about it. The person involved was rather a fairy tale hero. If he smiled, Janet was happy for days, but if he did not look her way or was annoyed with her, her misery was unbearable. In either case, her happiness was so intense or her misery so acute that she had to die. She could not live with such uncontrollable emotion. The first dramatic episode occurred when Peter took over the Saturday lab class. To no longer have me to teach her was unbearable. Next was the walking out of the room when the inspector arrived, occasioned really by the fact that I had passed her in the street the day previously without seeing her. Finally, the phone call on Friday had been due to the misery of having had her appointment for that day cancelled. 43. It took all of 3 hours to extract this story. When Frame left, after promising to return for another session in 3 days, Money wrote, "We are now at the stage of having cleared the debris away, and there is every possibility of building afresh. Much remains to be done, however. I think the crisis is past, now that so much pent-up emotion is got rid of." 44. Money was mistaken. In the middle of that week he received a letter from Frame, written in what he had come to recognize from assignments as her parable mode. It said, inter alia, "I am a snail. I was a happy snail at first. People tried to help me to poke my head out of my shell and wander, with my eyes on stalks, past rows and rows of beans and carrots and radishes. But I am easily frightened and it isn't always spring and the wind outside is very often a white whiplash. So I am going back to the first place of my mind, my secret cabbage patch world, to feed alone on my private cabbage leaves of fantasy, and even if the sky of my world is sometimes thick with thrushes, I'll be a reticent snail and utter none of my secret snail cries or thoughts to anybody. I am not returning to school. Snails are not teachers. I am leaving Dunedin as soon as I can for what T.S. Eliot would call a journey, and such a long, long journey. I shall have my house on my back." 45. The following Thursday Frame failed to keep a late afternoon appointment and again rang Money from a public telephone. His notes record. After announcing her name, she again informed me of a renewed intention to die. She wanted no police sent after her. She was not going to be so naive about her death this time, but had planned it. She would not tell me where she was, and she was going straight away from there, to die. She was much more resolute and grimly determined, with no crying, but sometimes a deep swallow before the words flowed. I told her that I did not believe that she really would die, that she could look upon any hostile feelings towards me as quite in order. Then, the penny ran out. I rang Henry, feeling that before any major improvement came, Janet should receive some sort of convalescent guardianship. Then there was the risk that should her compulsion succeed, the psych department's name would be black. As a result, Peter and Henry and I went up to her boarding house, arriving at about 9:30. Everything was dark, the landlady was away in Wellington, and we could get no response for a long while. Then Janet appeared in night clothes. Henry announced himself. She screamed, "Oh," and slammed the door and ran away. Shortly she reappeared and conversation was resumed. She said there was nothing wrong with her, not even worry, which Henry suggested. Why were we concerned about her? At this point I took over. Wouldn't you be worried if someone rang you on 2 occasions saying that things were so bad that she would have to die? From this point on I had one, and it was just a matter of gentle suggestion and convincing that it would be a good thing for her to have a spell in hospital in order to pick up the threads and gain a new control over her emotions. Her threatened suicide was not fantastic. Her shoes were muddy and wet, indicating the truth of her perfectly frank statement that she had been out to the cliffs at St. Clair, intending to throw herself into the sea. But she thought of something humorous about the camel with sore feet which prevented its getting to water which was not far off, and her own feet being sore, she decided not to continue the journey. I had previously discussed the matter with Dr. Malcolm Brown of Seacliff, on the phone, so that there was no problem of admittance to the public hospital. 46. And so at 10:30 p.m. on October 18, 1945, Janet Frame was committed to the Calhoun ward, which she later discovered was the psychiatric ward at Dunedin Public Hospital. It was only, she believed, for a few days' rest, and her initial reaction to that prospect was benign. I suddenly felt free of all worry, cared for. I could think of nothing more desirable than lying in bed sheltered and warm, away from teaching and trying to earn money, and even away from Mrs. Wadsworth, and her comfortable home, and away from my family and my worry over them, and from my increasing sense of isolation in a brave, bright world of brave, bright people, away from being 21 and responsible, only not away from my decaying teeth, 47. 5 days later John Money was reporting, after several visits, that Frame was getting on very well. She now talks perfectly normally to me, although she is very shy of the doctors and beats about the bush and talks rather stupidly with them. They, therefore, settle themselves with the belief that she is on the way to being insane. I do so hope that they do not send her to Seacliff. I am working hard to get her in a frame of mind to be able to talk to them as easily as to me. 48 Seacliff was the psychiatric hospital to the north of Dunedin, much feared among the general community in Otago for both its appearance, grey stone, built like a castle, 49, and the fact that loonies committed there were not infrequently incarcerated for life. Every family secretly feared the loss of a loved one through its grim portals. It was the institution that Lottie Frame had rejected so vigorously as a destination for her epileptic son. Unbeknown to Frame, the few days' rest that she had begun rather to enjoy was, as far as the health system was concerned, a period of observation to diagnose her mental state and decide where she should most appropriately be sent, home, to Oamaru, or, up the line, to Seacliff. There was no third option. The speculation she had shared with Sheila Trail, about what it would be like to go mad, or be considered mad, was a game with far higher stakes and more drastic consequences than she could imagine. It would involve other people making decisions about how much control she would be allowed over her own life. But Frame had no idea what was at risk, and she behaved towards the hospital doctors as she had initially behaved in her counseling sessions with John Money. As Money had observed, she now seemed relaxed and well in conversation with him, and pleased to be the object of his continuing attention. But when doctors attempted to interview her she became inhibited, elusive, sometimes overly dramatic, and subject to fits of nervous giggling. This behavior, in conjunction with her suicide attempt and her interest in psychology, was subject to far more sinister interpretation than Frame could have known. The clinical notes from one of her interviews read: "She lies in bed with her head buried in the bedclothes and grins foolishly when addressed. She is able to give a good account of her previous life. She admits having made an attempt at suicide by taking Aspros. At this time, I fell in love with a man but he did not love me. This got me down." She states that she does not like teaching. She has been attending lectures at Otago University and shows an undue interest in psychology. She is rather of the introvert type and finds mixing with others difficult. She plans leaving teaching and doing library work, showing no realization of her present condition or of her future abilities. 50. One interview, possibly that from which the above notes were taken, was by Dr. Malcolm Brown, superintendent of Seacliff Hospital. He told John Money 5 days after Frame had entered Dunedin Hospital that he thought she would have to go out to Seacliff. His diagnosis is incipient schizophrenia. In her conversations with me all the schizophrenic symptoms disappear, but they apparently reassert themselves when he interviews her, as he engenders fear and resistance. 51 Frame was told nothing of this diagnosis nor, even, that transferal to Seacliff was under consideration. On the contrary, one of the nurses, Maitland Brown, told her confidently, "You won't be going there. There's nothing wrong with you." 52 and Frame, having just met and disliked a patient who was going to Seacliff, saw no reason to disagree. John Money, who was at this time glistening with newly applied Freud, sought ways to help Frame and give her something constructive to do in hospital in addition to reading and resting. 53 He asked her to write down her dreams so that they could discuss their symbolism in the course of his visits to the ward. This was an attempt at an elementary form of psychoanalysis, a therapy with which Money was familiar through his reading, but of which hospital doctors in New Zealand at this time knew little, and what little they did know, they distrusted or dismissed. Frame was eager to cooperate and quickly produced a series of dreams which she would have known Money would find significant. By October 30th it seemed that whatever crisis had seized Frame was now past. Hospital staff announced that she could now go home to Amaru and that, after a holiday there, she would be good as new. 54 This was not what the patient had expected, however. She had assumed that, after her arrest, she would be discharged to find a job in Dunedin, possibly in the library, and that she would be able to continue with her university studies and her writing. Frame wrote later. Faced suddenly with the prospect of going home, I felt all the worries of the world returning, all the sadness of home and the everlasting toil of my parents and the weekly payments on the blankets and the new eiderdown from Calder McKay's, and the payments to the Starbucket Building Society or we'd be turned out of our house again, and the arguments at home, and mother's eternal peacemaker intervention, and my decaying teeth. When I saw mother standing there at the entrance to the ward, in her pitifully best clothes, her navy costume and her navy straw hat with the bunch of artificial flowers at the brim, with a hint of fear in her eyes, for, after all, I had been in a mental ward, and her face transparently trying to adopt the expression all is well, I knew that home was the last place I wanted to be. I screamed at mother to go away. She left, murmuring her bewilderment, but she's such a happy person, she's always been such a happy person. 55. No one asked Frame why she had screamed at her mother, nor why the prospect of going home had caused her to panic. Instead she was forbidden further visitors, including money, and all her books were removed, especially her psychology texts, which hospital staff were convinced were contributing to her illness. They are accepting the popular fallacy that an interest in psychology and conversation about it is unhealthy, Money noted glumly, and that this drives one mad. 56 He sensed too that the ward doctors were now preventing him from seeing their patient, because of his insistence that it was therapeutic for Frame to talk about her difficulties. There would be no more therapy of this sort. Events now moved swiftly and irrevocably. Frame was held incommunicado until Malcolm Brown was able to interview her again on November 2nd. Having done so, he instigated committal proceedings under the Mental Defectives Act. Marty Frame, as next of kin, was persuaded to sign an application to have her daughter admitted to Seacliff Mental Hospital. Two Dunedin general practitioners, Warren John Boyd and Eric Robin Hardy, certified that in their view the patient was mentally defective and suicidal and required oversight, care or control for his sick, own good, or in the public interest. 57 A magistrate then signed the committal order and authorized a police constable to escort Janet Patterson Frame to Seacliff Hospital the following day. 58 The trajectory that had previously lofted Frame, whether she wanted it or not, towards a career in teaching, had been arrested. Her life was now deflected with the same degree of momentum in an altogether different direction. And it would take her to some dark places. Seacliff Mental Hospital, as its name suggests, loomed high over the Pacific Ocean on a wild stretch of coast 30 kilometers northeast of Dunedin. In keeping with Otago's predominant culture of origin, the hospital's architectural style was known as Scottish Baronial. 1 To non-residents, who feared both its patients and its staff. The turrets and mock battlements gave the building the appearance of a castle out of a Gothic novel or a horror movie. Seacliff was, in fact, a Victorian lunatic asylum, with all the qualities that designation implies. It was vast, the largest public building in the country for 50 years from the time it opened in 1884. The main section was constructed of stone and cement and was unheated. Some of the original sleeping accommodation for patients was in single cells, locked and shuttered at night, the rest in dormitories. A concrete exercise yard was surrounded by high walls. Even in 1886, when it was only 2 years old, the main building was described as inexpressibly dreary and dispiriting. 60 years later little had changed for the better inside the hospital. In the absence of amenities which might be characterized as modern, the institution functioned in effect as a prison for most of the more than 1,200 patients deemed to require custodial care. Treatment was limited to traditional work therapy, which for women patients meant sewing or cleaning duties, to electroconvulsive or insulin shock therapy, or to the operation known as prefrontal lobotomy, which severed many of the fibers connecting the front part of the cerebral cortex to the remainder of the brain and reduced some patients to a vegetative, albeit less anxious, condition. If all these features were insufficient to terrify those threatened with incarceration in Seacliff, and their loved ones, there were conditions there that made life additionally unpleasant and unsafe. A continuing shortage of nursing and medical staff had been exacerbated through the war years to the point where, In the opinion of a 1943 Royal Commission, their numbers were insufficient to provide even the most basic care and supervision of patients. 3 Partly as a result of this, a fire that swept through one of the women's wards 3 years before Janet Frame's arrival had incinerated 37 patients, the worst accident of its kind in the country's history to that time. Further disasters were threatened by the fact that the hill on which the main building stood was gradually subsiding towards the sea. New cracks appeared almost weekly in the floors, walls, and ceilings of the main building. Water supplies and sewage lines were severed frequently by the slippage, causing unpleasant odors and sanitation problems and placing enormous strains on the minimal maintenance staff. And it was largely these structural problems that led to the progressive demolition of the hospital between 1937 and 1960, and the eventual removal of patients to other institutions, most notably to nearby Cherry Farm at Waikouaiti from 1957. For those who hated and feared the institution, this dismantling of Seacliff was analogous to the removal of a cancerous growth from the Otago landscape and body politic. Critics of New Zealand's mental hospitals attributed Seacliff's multiple accidents and shortcomings to poor engineering and construction decisions, inadequate financial and human resources, and the inertia of a heavily bureaucratic health system that seemed unwilling to modernize methods of patient care and treatment. Otago Maori had another view of the origin of the hospital's problems, however. They believed that the authorities had courted physical and psychic disaster by building the hospital over a tribal burial ground. According to this interpretation, the structural collapses, the fire, and the general air of terror said to prevail in wards holding the most disturbed patients were all consequences of a failure to respect the ethos and the tapu of the location. 4. Janet Frame arrived at Seacliff Hospital mid-morning on November 3, 1945, in the company of a police constable, 2 girls from Borstal, and a police matron. Her admission notes describe her as a well-nourished young woman in good bodily health. She was 21 years old, had frizzy red hair, stood 5 feet 4 inches in height and weighed 9 stone 6 ounces. She bore no marks, scars, or communicable diseases. Because she was a committed mental patient, however, her every mannerism was noted in that light. This girl is most foolish and fatuous in her manner and conversation, grins foolishly when addressed and tends to inattention. Is quite unconcerned at being here and generally emotionally apathetic. Adopts a listening attitude but denies hallucinations. 5. To allow a period of observation, Frame was assigned to a women's ward and allocated domestic duties in the nurse's home. She was permitted to come and go between these places, and to wander further afield through the hospital buildings and spacious grounds. She chose to reveal little of her inner feelings to the overworked nurses and medical staff, hence the repeated comment in her notes, shows no concern at being here, but they, forever busy and moving quickly, made no attempt to discuss her thoughts and feelings with her. In fact, her concern was considerable and she was profoundly shocked at much of what she saw, indeed, went out of her way to see. 1. Peeped through the fence of a building called Simla, away up on the hill, where there were strange men in striped shirts and trousers and some without trousers, walking round and round in a paddock with the grass worn away, and, I saw, a paddock of women, too, wearing the dark blue striped clothes. There was a cart, like a rickshaw, that passed every day by the ward, full of coal, and 2 men harnessed to the cart carried the coal, driven by one of the attendants. 1. Peered into a room that stank of urine and was full of children lying in cots, strange children, some of them babies, making strange noises, their faces wet with tears and snot. I saw people with their eyes staring like the eyes of hurricanes surrounded by whirling unseen and unheard commotion contrasting strangely with the stillness. 6. Still nobody informed Frame that she had been diagnosed as a chronic schizophrenic, though this term had entered her medical records at Dunedin Hospital. Because all discussion about her symptoms had ceased with the banishment of John Money, he was forbidden by medical staff to visit her at Seacliff. She remained unaware that she was in fact being observed closely and her behavior interpreted and recorded in her medical notes. On December 7th, for example, transferred to the cottage, an open ward, today, her behavior has been more stable of late, although still rather foolish. She has a detached mien and appears still to live in a fantasy. Writes extremely foolish letters. 7. Some of these letters were to her family, some to John Money and Sheila Trail, to whom she wrote, "We are in a way kindred souls, NSCE pa." 8. None that has survived seem especially foolish. They simply display an understandable preoccupation with her own state of mind, in which nobody at the hospital gave her any indication that they were interested, and they express her customarily quirky view of the world, that a difference so often commented on by her teachers and lecturers, but unfamiliar to the hospital authorities, and apparently unwelcome. In one such letter, to her sister June, Frame described Gorse as smelling like peanut butter. A doctor who read this then withheld her outward letters for a time and told her mother that she had a disordered mind, quoting the peanut butter remark as incontrovertible evidence. 9. To Money, after warning him that all her correspondence was read, she noted that, in spite of the rather shocking conditions and meals, Seacliff life is interesting and Seacliff people most lovable. I am happy and extroverted with the patients but terrified of matrons, sub-matrons, and doctors. I want to go home. Being good imposes an awful strain, and one becomes weary of smiling and singing and creating a happy impression so that the doctor will say, "You have recovered." 10. To Sheila Trail she quoted one of Money's letters to her, as an indication of how perceptive and helpful his advice to her had been. Money had written, "Many people suffer a loneliness of spirit which becomes so overwhelming that at last it forces its possessor to grasp violently at the nearest straw. This is a typical manifestation in our cultural pattern and produces a pattern of behavior which is mostly called love, but which more truly can be called pathological love. It is a search for a redeemer rather than for a cooperator in the mutual enterprise of parenthood, which is the ultimate goal and rationality of true love. When such a person finds a possible redeemer, he or she clings possessively for fear of letting such a fortunate-looking chance escape. 11. This was as close as anybody got at this time to understanding what was wrong with Frame, the bereaved twin, who had grown up feeling that her family were outcasts and that she was different, who had lost her older sister when she was 12 and never properly grieved for that loss, who was awkward, unconfident and lacking in social skills in adolescence, and who in young adulthood took refuge in literature to compensate for timidity and loneliness. Her lack of socialization made her less mature than most of her contemporaries, and she had indeed focused a kind of pathological love on her handsome and charming psychology lecturer. When there seemed to be no prospect that her feelings would be reciprocated, she had been gripped by a form of hysteria that generated apparently psychotic symptoms. In the enforced isolation of Seacliff, Frame could perceive much of this and accept it. "He's very frank, isn't he?" she wrote to Sheila Trail in reference to John Money. "He is revising my ideas on love, but I think, as I nearly always think of him, that what he says is very true. 12 Her future difficulties would result in part from an inability to retain this insight. In the course of her 6-week hospitalization, however, it was the plight of patients in her own ward that most engaged Frame's attention and sympathies. As she had indicated to Money, in the company of people who were infinitely more damaged than she, her customary shyness and timidity seemed to evaporate. She became almost parental in her concern for them. She told Money about one woman who was obsessive about cleanliness. She would plunge her hands in hot soapy water and hold them under the surface. "Under, Janet?" she would question. And I would stand by serious and loving her very much. "Yes. Under." The highest tribute Miss X could pay to anyone was to invite the sharing of that under experience. 13. In another letter she attempted to convey the tumult of Seacliff life and the emotions she felt being part of it. "Rise, ladies. Laundry, ladies. Sewing room, ladies. Day room, ladies. Keys and locks, the nurse's uniform pink like the cherry blossom, and the big deep pockets full of keys. Day room and park. Come and sit in the sun," I said to one woman. "No, no," she cried, "sun on the head'll make you mad." Oh, and Gracie and Rosie and Big Lil and all of them. And the sad woman who thought she was living in a biscuit factory. "Where's Mr. Hudson, of Cadbury Fry Hudson? I want to speak to the manager this instant." And Ina, who had been a music teacher. Music? Ina wets the bed and is struck for it and hauled across the floor. And the little brown-faced woman is slapped because when the door is open she runs to get out. But we all do. They open a door and we run. What is it like out? Out there? They kick her behind and push her and pull her. I do not forget what it is like to be made into an animal and see others trampled on and hurt and not understood. And why do the nurses shout? "Hey you, get back in there. Hey Millie. Dear Millie, you are my mother. You bathed me and fed me and warmed me when I was small. And when you got hot the sweat trickled down the hole between your breasts and under your arms and I cuddled up to you and got warmer being close to you, warm and sticky and you tasted sweet. Hey you, Millie. Who walks among the boonies, kissing them and stroking their lousy hair? Dear Jay, where is the heart and the river? 14. In her autobiography Frame said of this time that she had discovered a personal, geographical, even linguistic exclusiveness in this community of the insane, who yet had no legal or personal external identity, no clothes of their own to wear, no handbags, no purses, no possessions but a temporary bed to sleep in with a locker beside it, and a room to sit in and stare, called the day room. Many patients confined in other wards of Seacliff had no name, only a nickname, no past, no future, only an imprisoned now, an eternal island without its accompanying horizons, foot or handhold, and even without its ever-changing sky. 15. So infused did Frame become with concern for the welfare of patients, and for their stories, that June Frame, visiting the hospital, became convinced that her sister had tricked her way in there so as to observe and write a book about human behavior. 16. There was no crisis in her own behavior at Seacliff, however, no deterioration that would confirm the diagnostic label that had been attached at Dunedin Hospital. And yet she felt profoundly changed. I knew that I could not turn back to my usual life or forget what I saw. I felt as if my life were overturned by this sudden division of people into ordinary people on the street, and these secret people whom few had seen or talked to, but whom many spoke of with derision, laughter, fear. 17. Among those who shared the fear, of course, were members of her own family. And when she was released into their care on December 21, 1945, on probation, one of the doctors explained her illness to Lottie Frame and warned the mother to be alert for any recurrence of symptoms. 18. I looked at my family and I knew that they did not know what I had seen, Janet would write. And I noticed that their behavior had changed in subtle ways. Who knew what I might do? I was a loony, wasn't I? It seemed as if, having been in hospital, I had, like a spider, woven about me numerous threads which invisibly reached all those who knew, and bound them to a paralysis of fixed poses and expressions and feelings that made me unhappy and lonely but also gave me a recognition of the power of having spun the web and the powerlessness of those trapped within it. 19. After Frame had been back at Willowburn for a week or two, the family's apprehension diminished. Lottie Frame, as she was wont to do, began to deny everything. Janet was a happy person. There must have been some mistake. I found that everyone was pleased when I treated the matter as a joke, talking of amusing incidents at the country estate, likening it to a hotel. I described the surroundings. It's like a whole village, I said. They have their own farm, their own cattle and pigs, and all the waste from foods goes into the pig tin. They have their vegetable garden, and their flowers, too. And the grounds are full of trees, and there's a magnolia tree near where the superintendent lives. It was easier to talk as if I were a child on holiday describing what I'd seen and what adventures I had. 20. Soon a real holiday was in prospect. The family decided that a change would do Janet good. She was dispatched by train with June to the care of Lottie's relatives in Picton in the Marlborough Sounds. Over 2 summer weeks they swam, picnicked, took launch trips, visited relatives, and heard new versions of Godfrey family history. They returned to Oamaru with memories of steep green oppressive hills, their bush-clad slopes rising as inescapably close as neighbors. 21. Janet also came home to some unpleasant surprises. While she had missed the 1945 end-of-year examination, she had been told by John Money that she would pass her psychology paper on the basis of the whole year's work. Instead, she had failed. Had she neglected to fill in the appropriate forms? Then, when she attempted to withdraw money from her bank account, she was informed by an officer of a public trust that confiscation of my property was in my own interests as I was officially insane and would not have legal rights until my probation ended, and only then if the doctor declared my sanity. 22. An even greater shock was reserved for her visit to the mental clinic at Oamaru Hospital, where Seacliff Superintendent Malcolm Brown told her for the first time that she was suffering from schizophrenia. He gave her no explanation of the characteristics of the illness, acting as if she was incapable of comprehension. So she looked it up in one of her psychology textbooks to find it described as a gradual deterioration of mind, with no cure. of mind and behavior. This revelation came at precisely the time that she had begun to feel cured of whatever had been wrong with her. Now, she learned, she had a condition for which there was no cure. It seemed to spell my doom. It would lead me further and further away, and in the end not even my family would know me. 23. The need for a variety of decisions and practical arrangements kept even doom at bay, however. In 1946, June was to remain at high school for another year before starting university. Isabel was to take up her first teaching position at Windsor School, 13 miles northeast of Amaru. Janet had no wish to remain at home, where the tension between her father and her brother was still palpable. She decided to advertise for a live-in job in Dunedin so that she could support herself, attend university and make a more concerted effort to write, although, as she told John Money in January 1946, she doubted if she would ever be able to show her work to anybody. Point 24. She had abandoned the idea of librarianship. That would have put her back in another institution, with layers of procedures, rules, and supervisors that she did not feel adequate to face. Her advertisement brought a reply from Mrs. T. Park of Playfair Street, Caversham. Mrs. Park kept a guest house with half a dozen boarders and 4 elderly women. Janet was offered and accepted the position of housemaid waitress nurse at 15 shillings a week plus keep. Her afternoons would be free for writing and studying. Point 25. Caversham in South Dunedin was a poor community where lives were spent in the eternal toil, with the low-lying landscape reflecting those lives, as if effort and hope were here washed away in the recurring floods. Frame had completed 2 of her teachers' college sections in the district and noted the poverty, the rows of decaying houses washed biscuit color by time and the rains and the floods, and the pale children light-haired and damp-looking, as if they emerged each day from the tide. Point 26. Frame's room at 63 Playfair Street was a converted linen cupboard, small, with shelves along one wall and a narrow bed against the other. The view from the one small window was pure Caversham, dreary grey stone buildings with a glimpse of the tall chimneys of Parkside, the home for the aged, resembling my idea of a 19th century English workhouse. 27. Her duties, which occupied 4 hours each morning, were to prepare and serve breakfast, to clean the house, and to attend to the 4 elderly women who lived, bedridden, each in a corner bed, in the large front room. I washed them, helped to turn them or arrange the rubber ring beneath their gaunt bodies where the skin hung in folds like chicken skin with bumps where feathers might once have been. I rubbed methylated spirits on the bedsores, and powdered their bodies. I fed them, sometimes with the aid of a white china feeding cup. I helped them use the wooden commode or arranged a bedpan beneath their drooping buttocks. 28. To her surprise, Frame found that one of the women, Mrs. McLennan, was the mother of Auntie Hahn, wife of her father's brother Bob Frame, and grandmother of Iona Livingston. Uncle Bob had by this time retired from the bakery and sold cigarettes, tobacco, horse racing guides and lottery tickets in a kiosk on Dunedin's Main Street. Also to her surprise, Frame discovered that she could cope easily with the work. I had gentleness and everlasting patience with the sick and the old. I enjoyed waiting on people, attending to their comfort, doing as they asked, bringing the food they ordered. I had no impatience, irritation, anger, to subdue. I seemed to be a born servant. The knowledge frightened me. I was behaving as my mother had done all the years I had known her, and I was enjoying my new role. I could erase myself completely and live only through the feelings of others. 29. Frame had told the Parks that she was a student engaged in private research. This explained her need to vanish into her tiny room as soon as her chores were finished, even to take her meals there, as she had done at Auntie Izzie's and Mrs. Wadsworth's. She did do some studying. She had enrolled in a philosophy paper, Logic and Ethics, at Otago University. But what she mainly did there, sitting on the bed, was read literature and write stories and poems. The inspiration for her stories, she wrote later, came partly from reading the Californian writer William Saroyan and thinking, I can do that too. 30. But now in this, her 4th year in Dunedin, she had begun to read the work of New Zealand writers. In Modern Books, a left-wing bookshop in Moray Place, Dunedin, Frame had bought 3 books published by the Caxton Press in Christchurch over the preceding year. One was a collection of precociously brilliant poems by an 18-year-old Dunedin writer, James Keir Baxter, called Beyond the Palisade. The second was a book of New Zealand verse 1923-45 edited by the Christchurch poet and journalist Alan Curnow, and the third was an anthology of short stories collected by the Auckland fiction writer Frank Sargison, called Speaking for Ourselves. All three were to have the effect of focusing Frame's imaginative vision back onto the country, and onto the specific places in which she actually lived. The fact that they displayed the work of New Zealand writers, some of whom lived in Dunedin and Christchurch, the next city north, gave her an inkling that her own secret ambition to be a writer might yet be capable of fulfillment. As a child, she wrote subsequently, I had looked on New Zealand literature as the province of my mother, and when I longed for my surroundings, to awaken to imaginative life, all I could do was populate them with characters and dreams from the poetic world of another hemisphere and with my own imaginings. There was such a creation as New Zealand literature. I chose to ignore it, and indeed was scarcely aware of it. Few people spoke of it, as if it were a shameful disease. 31. With the acquisition of the 3 Caxton books, another world opened up for her. While she found the Baxter poems complex and intimidating, the force and the variety of work in the anthologies gave me hope for my own writing while awakening in me an awareness of New Zealand as a place of writers who understood how I had felt when I imported J.C. Squire to describe my beloved South Island rivers. Now, I could read in Alan Kernow's poems about Canterbury and the plains, about dust and distance, about our land having its share of time and not having to borrow from a northern Shakespearean wallet. And there was Dennis Glover using the names of our own rivers and places, and even writing about the magpies, perfectly recording their cries on a misty autumn morning. And Charles Brash confiding in the sea as I had confided, without words, in the Clutha, Speak for Us, Great Sea. The stories, too, overwhelmed me by the fact of their belonging. It was almost a feeling of having been an orphan who discovers that her parents are alive and living in the most desirable home. 32. These writers, Sargison, Curnow, Glover, Brash and Baxter, and E.P. Dawson, who wrote the story in Speaking for Ourselves that most affected her, Maria, about the influence of the New Zealand bush over an artist, each of them would eventually have roles to play in Frame's personal or professional life. Early in 1946, however, she was aware of them as a portent and part of the excitement of being in a land that was coming alive with its own writing. Speaking for itself, point 33 there was, it seemed to her, a great awakening occurring in the imaginative life of her country. The excitement generated by this realization blended with the sense of discovery that 6 weeks in Seacliff had brought, and with the effect of interacting daily with the boarding house residents. Her experience was throwing up a myriad of ideas for characters and stories. While I fed the guests, they fed me from the invisible bowl of their feelings, she wrote later. Point 34 at the time, she swallowed and digested great gulps of their actions and mannerisms. No, I won't read the paper tonight, Annie. It's my eyes. Just pass me the births, deaths, and marriages. Take out my curlers for me, will you? There's a dear. I could swear that Dr. Boy wasn't married, but I may be wrong. I'll ask my niece. She knows Dr. Marion White. Does she, dear? I've heard she's good. You have to have an appointment. Hell, the humanity, the wonderful humanity of people. I'm going to spend all my life studying and writing about them, she was to tell John Money, but the ordinary people mostly, who are in the dark. 35. In the course of her first month at Caversham, her writerly ambitions were given further impetus by the publication of the story she had written the previous year for the New Zealand Listener, University Entrance. This, her first piece of adult writing to appear in print, grew out of the anxiety she had felt in her school days whenever she had had to ask her father for money. It has recognizably autobiographical elements, the portraits of her mother and father, the cash she had on Miss Macaulay, called Miss Heffy in the story, the depression she experienced leaving the world of literature at school and coming home to face more prosaic realities, and, above all, the constant anxiety about money. It adds up to a competently realized piece of fiction, however, with an axis that turns on her father's unexpected willingness to hand over the 2 guineas and the change of mood that this provokes in the narrator. Point 36. Chrysler could not have been more sympathetic nor more willing to help. As John Money had anticipated, she was deeply interested in literary and artistic things, and the fact that her new patient was gifted and well-read gave her an additional reason to be attentive to Frame's problems and needs. Despite this commitment, however, the counseling sessions did not go well. Frame eventually confessed to Money that she found herself unable to talk with Chrysler. I cannot free associate. Even with you I have never been able to free associate in speech. Now I cannot even in writing. 28 There appeared to be two separate but related problems. Frame found herself unable to establish with her new therapist the kind of rapport that had enabled her, for the most part, to talk freely with money and to manufacture her schizophrenic symptoms. And, at times, the two women experienced problems fully understanding each other, apparently because of linguistic difficulties. 29. There was one decisive thing that Greta Chrysler was able to do, however. She arranged for Frame to have all her top teeth removed under anesthetic at Christchurch Public Hospital. This operation was performed in December 1947. And she had an innovative suggestion to make about her patients' mental or emotional problems. She thinks my mind is so much divided that only a physical shock will unite it, Frame told Money. She has advised me to go to Sunnyside Hospital for some shock treatment. What are your thoughts about it? 30 Cautiously, Money advised that she should not expect too much from the relatively newly introduced electroconvulsive therapy. 31. Late in February 1948, accompanied by Greta Chrysler, Frame went back to the Christchurch Public Hospital for an assessment of her mental health, and from there she was admitted as a voluntary patient to Sunnyside Mental Hospital. She was, again, desperately unhappy, and she had given up trying to distinguish which of her symptoms were real and which were fabricated in her efforts to preserve her schizophrenic identity. Her letters to John Money at this time suggest that her state of mind was close to that of the fictional narrator in her later novel, Faces in the Water, who described entering a season of peril. I was put in hospital because a great gap opened in the ice floe between myself and the other people whom I watched, with their world, drifting away through a violet-colored sea where hammerhead sharks in tropical ease swam side by side with the seals and the polar bears. I was alone on the ice. A blizzard came and I grew numb and wanted to lie down and sleep, and I would have done so had not the strangers arrived with scissors and cloth bags filled with lice and red-labeled bottles of poison and other dangers. And the strangers, without speaking, put up circular calico tents and camped with me, surrounding me with their merchandise of peril. 32. Sunnyside Hospital near Spraydon, on the outskirts of Christchurch, had been established a decade earlier than Seacliff, and the first superintendent had been a grandfather of the writer Gail Marsh. Its grey Gothic cement main building was every bit as grim as Seacliff's castle. At first, though, it did not seem to Frame to be as primitive as her old alma mater, because of the kindness of nursing staff and the fact that she did not encounter the most seriously disturbed patients. 33. Almost immediately her sympathies were again engaged by patients in the grip of unshakable obsessions. One, an elderly woman, shuffled past her frequently, saying, "Oh dear, what shall I do? I caused the world." 34. Another refused to eat or dress because she believed that by doing so she would be stealing from others. This patient was tortured by a voice that said to her, over and over, "Thief, thief, you're a thief." 35. After her experience of therapy with John Money and Greta Chrysler, Frame concluded rapidly that these disorders, and her own, were made more acute by the fact that the patients were not given an opportunity to talk about them. One doctor told her that the hospital disapproved of psychotherapy because it makes you talk too much and think too much about yourself. 36. What Sunnyside did believe in, for certain categories of patients suffering from depression or schizophrenia, was electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. This treatment had been introduced into New Zealand hospitals over the previous 3 years. It involved attaching electrodes to the scalp and passing an electric current through the brain of sufficient strength to cause convulsions and a short-term coma. At this time, no anesthetics or muscle relaxants were used in association with the treatment, and patients were restrained manually to prevent injury. They were fully conscious up to the time the electric pulses took effect. They found it an exceedingly unpleasant experience. ECT also resulted in memory loss for immediately preceding events and, in the case of patients subject to multiple doses, in longer-term memory impairment. On days when ECT was to be administered, the atmosphere in wards resembled that in prisons on a day of execution. 37. Frame's experience of the procedure was traumatic. My life was thrown out of focus. I could not remember. I was terrified. 38. She had 2 courses of ECT at Sunnyside, twice a week for a total of 12 weeks. In addition to memory loss, the treatment triggered nightmares. I dreamed waking and sleeping dreams more terrible than any I had dreamed before. If only I had been able to talk about some of the terror, I know I would not have so readily translated my feelings into action. It sounds silly, but my clothes haunted me. Everything tortures me, and is on fire and is colored 39 after one application of ECT. Frame, smashed a window with my fist. I cannot remember why, maybe as an outlet for some strange feeling which had no other means of escaping. 40 The letter in which Frame communicated all this to Money had to be smuggled out of the hospital, as she was convinced the Sunnyside censors would not allow it to be posted. So badly did Frame react to both the prospect and the aftermath of ECT that it became difficult to ascribe cause and effect to her subsequent behavior. She believed that the treatment was making her more confused and disturbed. The doctors appeared to think that the appearance of such symptoms indicated a need for further ECT. The confusion was apparent in her correspondence with Money, and her handwriting became less legible. In one letter, characteristically undated, she notes, "I had some verse from James Baxter recently, and if my memory hadn't been so buggered with shocks, I could have quoted them." 41 In another she has rallied sufficiently to say of Baxter, "I am interested in the development of his work simply because he is all symbols now. So far down has he gone into the unconscious. More than that, he has reduced poetry to talking of birth and death." 42. After 4 months in Sunnyside, Frame felt utterly alone. As in other mental hospitals, you were locked up, you did as you were told or else, and that was that. My shame at my toothlessness, my burning sense of loss and grief, my aloneness, and now, with June, lost in marriage, I felt as if there were no place on earth for me. I wanted to leave Sunnyside, but where could I go? I grieved for everything lost, my career as a teacher, my past, my home, where I knew I could never stay more than a few weeks, my sisters, my friends, my teeth, that is, myself as a person. I had woven myself into a trap. All I had left was my desire to be a writer. 43. Frame determined to leave Sunnyside in the latter part of June 1948. She did so, according to her hospital records, against medical advice. 44 And she told Money that the doctor in charge of her case shook his head and stared seriously at me. But, as she saw things, she had come up for a breath, out of the dark among worms and bugs and roots of dead and living trees. 45 She fled back to Willowglen, that poky little doll's house, the only place she had any right to call home. As before, she was charmed by the trees, the paddocks, the birds, and the animals, and dismayed by her mother's helplessness and her father's constant state of war with her brother. As before too, she found further refuge in reading and writing. Dostoevsky and Rilke are dear friends, she told Money by letter in August 1948, though I do puzzle. When I read them I become more acutely alive. I do not live here with these people, yet I do. 46 Frame had Greta Chrysler to thank for her new awareness of the German lyric poet Rainer Maria Rilke. Chrysler had lent her volumes of Rilke's poetry in translation, which led Frame to buy her own copy of Sonnets to Orpheus, in which the poet had attempted to discover a satisfactory spiritual position amid the decay of reality. 47 Frame devoured the work greedily, recognizing that its preoccupations were similar to her own, and that its expression was powerful and reverberative. She quoted to John Money, "Be not afraid of suffering, render heaviness back to the earth again. Mountains are heavy, and seas, and the tender trees that in childhood you set in their places have grown too heavy for you to sustain. Ah, but the breezes. Ah, but the spaces." 48. Commenting on this stanza, she wrote, "We are the children and we run about with worlds on our shoulders, little atlases, and not knowing, taking trees in our finger, saying stay there, tree, and the tree stays, even the giant fir and oak. Can one in childhood catch the other side of heaviness, seas flowing like light and mountains wavering delicate as shadows? My friend, you see the struggle in me between body and mind." 49. Part of that struggle was externalized in Frame's ambivalence about the happiness of her surviving sister. In May 1948, June Frame had married Wilson Gordon, whom she had met the previous year at Otago University. He was a gentleman, 12 years her senior, who had been interned for 4 years during the war as a conscientious objector. For the first 4 months of their married life the Gordons rented rooms in North Dunedin, then shifted to Auckland in September. "I do not confide in my sister now, though she confides in me," Frame wrote to John Money in August. "She and Wilson are very happy and I love them very much. But when she takes his hand or touches him, a despair strikes me, for I know that I will never be able to touch the man that I think of. I want the sun, somebody warm to touch and know, and make me feel that I am a wanted plant, not one of the lost seeds sprouting by mistake in a desert of ice and snow. 50. Nor was she unmindful of that other sister, lost the previous year. In July she had sent Money another story, Swans, to be added to the collection that Caxton would publish. It arose from the death of one of the Eden Street cats and an early family visit to the beach. 51. But like so many of the stories that would appear in the first book, it was a suggestive exploration of innocence and experience, a juxtaposition of the timeless world of childhood with the adult world of time and death. In a subsequent letter to Money, in August 1948, Frame explained how Swans came to be written. The last thing I ever want to be is literary. I write because I am scared and haunted and lonely and in love and full of wonder. I am not thinking of what I shall say. In fact, I do not remember how I managed to say anything. I remember being haunted, and very often the original haunting is scarcely recognizable in what has been written, unless of course you have the clues. In Swans, the original haunting does not appear on the surface at all. I had been feeling a bit lonely for Isabel, and I kept seeing her as a child, outside a country store and lost. I do not consciously remember her ever having been lost in that way, but the vivid imagery persisted. There was the store, country stores, the fly dirt on the window and a dead fat blowfly lying just inside, and the empty packets of food and the sham chocolates. And outside there was a little fair-haired girl crying because she was lost. Nobody in the street, and the grey telegraph poles eaten by boar. And the wind high up, talking through the wires. I saw it vividly and I sat down and wrote, feeling sad because of Isabel's being lost, and my unconscious very kindly took us for a day at the beach, and sneaked in the sadness with the dead cat and the roan sea, and the father away at work, not sharing and not knowing. And so on. That is how the story gets written. I am interested to see how June's marriage will find its way on paper. I have been rather haunted, change and all that, and I am interested to see what kind of literary bread is baked when the haunting goes pop. 52. Swans, which Money forwarded to Glover at Caxton, was the last of the stories to be written for Frame's first book. Nearly 2 months later, instead of more stories, Frame had disturbing news for her expatriate friend. Even though her brother had moved, temporarily, to Australia, she was still finding life at Willow Glenwaring. So for some weeks she had been sleeping away from the house, in a tent under pine trees on the property. From there she had visited the monthly mental clinic at Almora Hospital, which she had agreed to do at the time she left Sunnyside. She told Money what occurred early in October. I was scared of course and didn't say much and got in a bit of a panic. This doctor has communicated with Sunnyside and they have decided that I should not be free, that I should have some further kind of treatment. The doctor has told my parents that my mental state is serious, that I am not well enough to be admitted to Seacliff as a voluntary boarder, and that my parents should commit me without delay. I don't care where I go or what happens to me, for I am sane. I am terribly sane, so much so that it looks to other people like insanity. So, they are taking me away to Seacliff. How strange. I do not feel that I shall lose any freedom there, for I have discovered that my freedom is within me and nothing can destroy it, and I remember Pierre and Tolstoy's War and Peace, how he was a prisoner and looked out of the window and laughed because the world was inside him, his own. 53. It was dangerous to bandy about literary illusions in dealings with the mental hospital system. The following day, for the second time in her life, Frame was formally committed to Seacliff Hospital. And one of the general practitioners who signed the medical certificate noted gravely that she says she is a lot of people. One of the persons is Pierre, 54. The other doctor identified her as a student who was mentally ill because of competition and overwork for exams, and this almost 4 years after she had sat her last examination. Such misunderstandings were possible because Frame did not cooperate with interrogation. 55. The second doctor went on to report that, when asked where she lived, the patient had replied, in the world. When asked if this meant that she lived in China, she replied, at times. 56. Lottie Frame was persuaded to sign the application for committal and declared that she did so, on advice of medical authorities and of Dr. McLaughlin, so that she will have to remain in mental hospital to have treatment completed. 57. Frame arrived at Seacliff on the afternoon of October 9th. Admission notes state that she had been asked to return as a voluntary boarder but had been too mentally ill to appreciate her obligations. When questioned, she repeated, "There's nothing to say, there's nothing to say." She recognized the hospital as Seacliff and admitted that she had previously been here. When asked about hallucinations, patient replied, "I'll be silly if I tell you what I hear. You would not let me go home." When she finally talked freely, patient's conversation revealed the extent of her illness. "I am in all places and I am everywhere. I find every place interesting." Patient is suffering from schizophrenia and is in urgent need of treatment, 58. This time frame was sent to Ward 4, which housed acute women patients. She was back in the monochrome world of hospital clothes and regimented routines of rise, ladies, day room, ladies, dining room, ladies, lavatories, ladies, and she was not allowed out of the ward for work therapy. Now all her days would be divided between the dormitory, the day room, the dining room and the treatment room. And the treatment, of which she was judged to be in urgent need, was to be a resumption of ECT. She was given daily shocks for the first fortnight, reducing to every 2 or 3 days for another month, then once or twice a week until mid-January 1949. Lottie Frame, filled with anxiety, and perhaps too feeling some guilt, heard no news of Janet. And so, a fortnight after her daughter's admission, she wrote to Dr. McLaughlin, on whose pressing advice she had been persuaded to sign the committal application. The reply came from Malcolm Brown, still medical superintendent of Seacliff. Since admission, Janet has had intensive electrical treatment. Her prospects of complete recovery are not good. In future, would you please address any letters of inquiry to me, and not to individual members of my staff, 59. Frame was to spend 4.5 of the next 6 years in hospital. It was a period she would view later as the nadir of her life, and she wrote of her feeling of panic simply at being locked up by those who reminded me constantly that I was there for life. Point 60. The underlying cause of this sentence was not any continuing erratic or uncooperative behavior on her part. It was the diagnosis of schizophrenia attached to her 3 years before and never queried subsequently. In her hospital notes, taken up and consulted by each doctor with whom she would have a clinical association, she was not simply a schizophrenic, she was now a known schizophrene of several, soon to be many, years standing. Point 61. And schizophrenia, it was widely known, could not be cured. The most that could be hoped for was relief or remission, and that was the purpose of the electroconvulsive therapy. There was never any expectation that Frame would again be well. As the years passed, she wrote, and the diagnosis remained, with no one apparently questioning it even by formal interviewing or tests, I felt hopelessness at my plight. I inhabited a territory of loneliness which I think resembles that place where the dying spend their time before death, and from where those who do return living to the world bring inevitably a unique point of view that is a nightmare, a treasure, and a lifelong possession. At times I think it must be the best view in the world, ranging even farther than the view from the mountains of love, equal in its rapture and chilling exposure, there in the neighborhood of the ancient gods and goddesses. 62. That was very much a retrospective and a coming to terms with judgment. Frame was unable to retain any such perspective while she remained in hospital. Her letters written to John Money at the time she was undergoing electroconvulsive and, later, insulin shock therapy are less agitated than those written from Willowburn. But they are also far more bland, and, unusually for Frame, banal. This was partly an expression of the numbing effect that ECT had on her mind and memory, and since any suggestion of her genius would have been attributed to the full force of her schizophrenia, it may also have been an attempt to convince medical staff, who read her letters, that she was, well, able to behave like ordinary people, and hence be eligible for discharge. Such banality might also have been an indication that she was becoming institutionalized. One letter, written in November 1948, reads like a parody. Frame tells Money that she is deriving much pleasure from picture shows, cards, dances. The other night when we entertained ourselves with games, I found myself with a few fellow patients at a table in the day room sharing the excitement and vagaries of snakes and ladders. 63. This from a person who only months before had derived her excitement from the insights of Dostoevsky and Rilke. One source of continuing consolation, however, which she carried with her, alternatively clutched and concealed like a precious talisman, was the complete works of William Shakespeare, which June Gordon had given her in May 1948. It was confiscated when she was deemed to be refractory, and then she would scheme for its return. Frame did not often read the book, but instead simply turned the tissue-thin pages, which somehow conveyed the words to me. I had absorbed the spirit of the tempest. Even Prospero in his bookline cell had suffered shipwreck and self-wreck. His island was unreachable except through storm. 64. In March 1949, when she was once more on probation, Frame took a more cynical view. I smiled and said very well thank you when the doctor came on his rounds, though when I left he told me he had never spoken to me and knew nothing about me. But if I told the truth they would have kept me there. If I had told them that, strange people, perch in my mind and drop their cloud-white droppings. Or said I could easily hang myself on a spider web. Or said I am not real and am nothing, the sunbeam that is only a speck of dust. The trouble was, she continued, I am two people and every day the division is more marked. The woman who smiles and speaks when spoken to. And the one who feels like a scaled fish under the water, among secret weeds, where my mind sees color and listens to water moving and flowing. That is the only reality for me, my inside mind. 65. During this 3-month probation she sent further poems to John Money, and a 3,500-word story to Charles Brash for landfall. Her letter to Brash showed her customary absence of conviction and convention. Mr. Editor, a story. Crumbly and of poor grade. You probably won't want it. In that case burn it quickly or crush it into tiny pieces for rat darkness to sneak in and snuffle. 66. Brash neither accepted the story, he sent it on to Dennis Glover, nor replied to Frame's letter. Frame also wrote to Money at this time about a more substantial writing ambition. I have had a longing to write a sort of novel and trace the minds of people in and out of their mysterious weavings, and find what the whole of being has concealed. But, hell, I have to come down to earth and sleep and eat and talk or at least answer when someone speaks to me, and all that interrupting and futile nonsense which breaks over any delicate web hung out quietly and peacefully to catch the overwhelming sun. 67. There was no longer any mention by her of the putative book of stories which, more than 2 years after Caxton had accepted it, seemed no nearer publication. 68. She had a further confession to make to Money. On the occasions that she was back in Amaru, she said, she never visited old acquaintances, former fellow pupils or Waitaki girls' high school teachers. I cannot talk about myself. I cannot. Every month I have to go to the hospital and see one of the doctors from Seacliff. I have been able scarcely to say a word to them. I just go into a kind of dream, probably to escape the burden of their questioning. And my voice won't work. And if it did it would utter what they would think to be utter nonsense. I keep silent because, physically, I cannot speak. And last time it was worse because I acted like a child and ran away, and it was from Dr. Brown too. They haven't whisked me back to their asylum, yet, they just fill in a form to say that I am incapable of work. 69. Unaware that Frame herself was worried about such behavior and reflective about its meaning, however, Malcolm Brown did have her recalled to Seacliff at the end of May 1949. The intensive course of electroconvulsive therapy was resumed and maintained until the end of December. There is no evidence that Frame was able to write letters, poems, or stories over this period, nor was she permitted to bring her typewriter to hospital. Malcolm Brown wrote 2 letters in response to inquiries from Lottie Frame, assuring her that her daughter was thinking along more normal lines and beginning to take an interest in things, and doing some reading, needlework, and helping about the ward. 70. In February 1950 Frame was released yet again on probation. As soon as she was reunited with her typewriter at Willow Glen she reported to Money *** on what she had seen as the resumption of a battle of tactics and wits. I tried hard to act in what the authorities consider the normal way. I smiled when I waxed the floor. I said good morning when the doctor said good morning. I said yes certainly when I was asked to sweep and polish a long corridor. For polishing is quite normal, and saying good morning and smiling with just the right degree of sanity, such behavior is approved of and gets you out quickly. In Seacliff I had to act like a tramp. I mean I wrapped my mind belongings in a hanky on the end of a stick and slept on them, never daring to reveal them, or I should still be polishing. I suppose all my life I shall be a tramp, spotted hanky and all. I don't care. 71. but she did care. And now she followed what had become an established pattern of behavior. Each time she was discharged from Seacliff, she was longing to return to Amaru. But, after 2 months at home, she was ready again to contemplate a return to hospital, indifferent to what would turn out to be its horrors. On April 6, 1950, she was found wandering the corridors of Amaru Hospital and she asked for readmission to Seacliff. 2 days later she was back in the mental hospital, where she resumed ECT for another 5 months. On September 16, apparently happier, although, in effect, this meant simply less agitated, she was out again on probation. This time, fully aware of the previous record of remission and relapse, Frame attempted to break the pattern by taking a job. She nursed a terminally ill woman in Amaru, cleaned the house, prepared meals, and washed and ironed clothes for the invalid and her husband. But the household of grey people washed with sweat and tears was too debilitatingly depressing and she left after a month. 72 On a whim she applied for a job in radio, which was advertising for women announcers with good vocal qualities, good educational background, and a general and wide experience of life. Frame had all these, but she was defeated by the prospect of having to fill in forms in triplicate and report to a radio station for an interview and audition. 73. Instead, Frame decided to accept a long-standing invitation from her sister and brother-in-law to stay with them in Auckland. She was now convinced, and so was June Gordon, that to make significant progress and manage to stay out of hospital she needed to remove herself from the stresses and claustrophobia at Willowglen, which up to this time had seemed the only alternative to Seacliff. Frame, who had never been further north than Wellington, was also excited by the idea of Auckland. She longed to experience the northern climate, with all the differences of light, color, weather and landscape that the word subtropical implied. And she wanted to re-establish rapport with her sister and eliminate the guilt she had felt about their loss of intimacy since June's marriage to Wilson Gordon. 74. The stay with the Gordons, in Birkdale on Auckland's North Shore, lasted barely 1 month, however. They and their infant son enclosed one another while I stood awkwardly in the background, Frame would write later. If anyone called and looked my way, my shyness and self-consciousness, arising from my feeling of being nowhere, increased when my sister's friends asked, "How is she? Does she like being in Auckland?" I had become a third person, at home in Willowglen and now here in Auckland. Sometimes, as if I were my own obituary, people asked, "What was she?" I could no longer bear the nothingness. I retreated to an inward state, that is, I put on a mask, while at the same time totally aware of everything. I, in my nothingness and nowhereness, was asserting the nothingness and nowhereness of everything and everyone around me. 75 This condition, identified by a well-meaning but uncomprehending doctor as catatonic, alarmed the Gordons and persuaded them to take Frame to the Auckland Mental Hospital at Avondale, where she was committed on January 2, 1951. Just as Seacliff Hospital, in Otago usage, had been pop or down the line, in Auckland idiom Frame was now up the wow. The Avondale Mental Hospital stood on the bank of the Wall River, which drained into the upper reaches of the Waitemata Harbour. Like Seacliff and Sunnyside, it had been built in the 19th century and was modelled on large, prison-like Victorian asylums in England. If anything, conditions at Avondale were worse than those at Seacliff. More than 1,000 patients were crammed into tumbledown and often insanitary conditions. 76 Although the buildings were in the process of being renovated, the wards were unheated, the walls and ceilings covered with crumbling plaster. There was cracked linoleum on the floors. Acute staffing shortages meant that hospital routines were highly regulated, patients were managed rather than treated. On admission, Frame was described as suffering a very florid schizophrenic episode with pronounced aggressive trends and strongly expressed preoccupations with death. 77 Alarmingly, her height had risen 3 inches since her previous hospital admission, but this proved to be an error. She gave no response to questions and lay immobile in bed and resisted the taking of nourishment. 78 Because of what her hospital notes describe as a strong resentment of ECT, medical staff attempted to reduce the severity of her symptoms by the prolonged use of insulin shock therapy. This treatment produced comas and convulsions, accompanied by writhings and moanings, and was believed to have beneficial effects for schizophrenics. 79 It had no discernibly beneficial effect on Frame, other than to leave her drowsy and mentally numb, in the immediate aftermath. Frame believed in retrospect that she had been treated more harshly at Avondale than she had been at Seacliff or Sunnyside, even though the entire mental health service at this time was administered as if it were a single hospital. Her view was possibly a consequence of the fact that, once her earlier hospital records reached Auckland, she was identified as a schizophrenic of long standing, 6 years now having passed since the initial diagnosis, and that hard-pressed medical and nursing staff paid little attention to individual patients with what were deemed to be chronic disorders. When Frame attempted to assert herself and secure some privileges, to retrieve her typewriter, for example, and to write, she was dismissed by staff as intractable. And as the effects of insulin therapy intensified her confusion, she was consigned to Park House, a refractory ward where, as she wrote later, human beings became or were quickly transformed into living as animals. 80. This experience, in the early months of 1952, was the lowest point of all Frame's years in hospital. Once, in a moment of lucid optimism, she had assured John Money that, whatever happened to her, she knew that she had a final sanity, a kind of inviolable core from which in future I shall have to take my strength. 81. It was in Avondale that she had to reach most deeply into herself and draw on that last vestige of stamina and hope. One night, sleepless in Park House amid the howls of the demented and the stench of urine, she came as close as she would ever come to losing belief in her own identity and hope that she had any kind of future. She rolled on her straw mattress to face the darkened wall and recited the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff they comfort me. Just to say the words was a source of comfort, as it always had been. But this time there was more than comfort. The following morning, as if in answer to a plea, Frame was moved back to Ward 7, which she would always remember as an oasis with its park and willow tree and its friendly ward sister. 82. She took this to be a sign that prayers were heard, and that somebody, something, one of her mother's angels, was looking after her. She retained this conviction, and this memory, for the rest of her life. If this advance had been unexpected, so was the sequel. When she was back in Ward 7, thin, with sores and a discharging ear, infections picked up in Park House, a parcel arrived from Christchurch. The hospital's deputy superintendent, who had an abiding interest in all things cultural, described the event in Frame's hospital notes for March 4, 1952. She has just had a book of short stories, The Lagoon and Other Stories, published by the Caxton Press, in which she displays good verbal ability and a keen perceptiveness of the finer shades of emotional experience in a childish and immature sort of way. 83. Dr. Jeffrey Blake Palmer, who had already noted of this patient that, during periods of inaccessibility, she was prepared to speak with him in French, was intrigued and impressed. 84. And, though he was to leave Avondale that very month, he would not lose contact with his interestingly literary patient. For, in succession to Malcolm Brown, he had been appointed superintendent of Seacliff Hospital. The hospital authorities too were impressed. On February 29 they had declined to release Frame on probation. On March 19, 1952, however, a fortnight after Jeffrey Blake Palmer had noted the arrival of the Lagoon, Frame was permitted to leave Avondale to fly to Christchurch and Oamaru with June Gordon and her, now, 2 young sons, Ian and Neil. Wilson Gordon, who was selling advertising calendars on commission, followed by Carr, working his way south. They would all stay at Whittleglen. During the stopover in Christchurch, Frame's fragile pride in the Lagoon was shattered. Browsing through a copy of the Christchurch Press, she discovered the first review of her first book. It is produced with an elegance and care that the stories themselves scarcely deserve. This sort of thing has been done already by Frank Sargison, and one wearies of his imitators. Nearly all the sketches are impressions of childhood, with little or no real point or narrative interest, written in a style that consists of simple statements endlessly joined by a chain of eans. There is much use of the pronoun you, the dialogue is all run together into long paragraphs, and plenty of New Zealand slang and colloquialisms are thrown in to provide local color. The fact that Janet Frame remembers her childhood with vivid intensity cannot redeem the style which, up to a point, is suitable for evoking material images of the New Zealand scene, but can convey no emotions other than the simplest and the most sentimental. 4. The review, which was unsigned, ended with a quotation from the story Swans, which it ridiculed. Authors' encounters with first reviews amount almost always, to them, to a rite of passage. If they continue to write, the nature and verdict of such notices can condition how they feel about the reviewing process for the remainder of their lives. Frame's reaction to this one, come upon so casually, was to experience painful humiliation and rejection, and an immense torment of not knowing where to be. If I could not live within the world of books, then where could I survive? 5. It was both characteristic and understandable that she would always remember it, word for word, and that she would remain apprehensive about all reviews from that time on. Over a period of months, however, the consensus of reviewers was that the Lagoon signaled the arrival of a major new talent. The first notice to appear nationally, and one of the most influential, was Frank Sargeson's in the New Zealand Listener. Sargeson, who, according to the press reviewer, was the source of Frame's story models, and whose own first book had been disparaged by the very same newspaper, saw no evidence of imitation. Under the heading The New Light, he said that Frame's stories posed a momentous question. Can people ever be said to be truly at home when they can never quite decide whether it mightn't be an advantage to be somewhere else? But in the meantime there is the brick bungalow to camp in, and beneath its tiles love grows timid and fearful, faith and hope eventually become pinned to the ticket and tats, the children develop the nervous tensions that may never be resolved in a lifetime, and the adults either sleep the mental sleep from which there is no awakening, or suffer the emotional strangulation that is slow but sure, and as deadly as death. It is, all there, all clearly rendered in language which, despite its simplicity of statement and rhythm, is the author's own special creation. From now on our literature is the richer, and the author, Janet Frame, becomes one more light to help diminish the vast region of darkness by which we are all surrounded. 6. Dorothy Neal White, who had joined the staff of the Dunedin Teachers Training College as librarian in Frame's second year there, reviewed the book for that city's public radio station, Foya. Here, she said, is a collection of stories, which will rank in New Zealand literature beside Catherine Mansfield's Garden Party and Frank Sargeson's A Man and His Wife. Janet Frame works within the tradition of the New Zealand short story, and she also extends that tradition. She weaves her prose from the thread and idiom of everyday speech, and it is the sound rather than the sight of things New Zealand which is recorded. For Janet Frame, the emotional peaks are the illuminating experiences of life, perhaps, the only moments when we live at all. And, for Otago people, Neal White concluded, Frame's collection gave our experiences in these latitudes. The sanctity of print. 7. Neal White followed this up with a letter to Frame in which she expressed congratulations and gratitude. 8. The review in Landfall was written by Patricia Guest, whose sister Hilary Muir had been a contemporary of Frame's at Teachers College. It was not without qualification, but concluded that the stories were written unsentimentally, though, with great compassion and understanding. They provided an opportunity to put a wise ear to the keyhole of a mind more sensitive than one's own, an experience that induces respect and humility. The Lagoon was a considerable achievement, but, even more, it was a promise of future work of distinction. 9. It is doubtful that any previous New Zealand book by a first-time author had attracted such widespread admiration. The ripples, too, spread beyond reviews. Sargeson urged the book on Dan Davin at Clarendon Press in Oxford and persuaded him to include one story, The Day of the Sheep, in an anthology of New Zealand stories which Davin was selecting and introducing for Oxford University Press's World's Classic Series. 10. It's a damn fine work, Sargeson told Davin, and the poor girl is out of the wow at last, I hope for good, though if it buggers her writing she might just as well have stayed in. 11. Sargeson also recommended the book to fellow writers Maurice Duggan, who was in London in 1952, E.P. Dawson, Ruth Dallas and Dennis McEldowney. 12. Other writers to be and at least one future publisher would record being affected by the Lagoon at impressionable times in their lives. 13. The book caused something of a minor sensation in Oamaru. Those who knew the Frames or who were part of the Waitaki Girls High School network were astonished, and in some cases angered, that they could recognize the characters who had inspired some of the stories, and that some of these characters, Mrs. Feathers, for example, and the teacher Miss Gibson, retained their real names. 14. In spite of indignation expressed on her behalf, however, Janet Gibson pronounced herself pleased with the story in which she featured Miss Gibson and the number. Room. 15. The book reportedly sold well in Oamaru, Christchurch and Dunedin and, although no sales figure survived, was printed by Caxton in a second edition in 1961.16. Given past patterns, it was unsurprising that this crisis brought on another. Janet returned voluntarily to Seacliff on May 9, telling the admitting doctor that the move was an escape mechanism from her inability to adjust herself to home life. Point 20. Her treatment was a repetition of what had occurred in Auckland. She was sent to Seacliff's equivalent of Park House, a ward for the most disturbed patients, which was known as the Brick Building. I now had what was known as a history, and ways of dealing with those with a history was stereotyped, without investigation. I was removed to the back ward, where I became one of the forgotten people. It was, now, recognized that I was in hospital for life. I felt a sense of hopelessness as the months passed, in a constant state of physical capture where I was at the mercy of those who made judgments and decisions without even talking at length to me or tried to know me or even submitting me to the standard tests. The state could be defined as forced submission to custodial capture. 21. Over the next 19 months, Frame was part of what she called a memorable family, a group of patients whose character and behavior she would describe in detail in her second novel, Faces in the Water. Point 22. It was their sadness and courage and my desire to speak for them that enabled me to survive. 23. She was helped also, she would say later, by the insight and care of nurses such as Buddy Doherty and Rosie Murray, both Tuho Maui from the Bay of Plenty, Jean Powell, who was Welsh, and inevitably, the known as Taffy, and Noreen Ramsey. Point 24. The attitude of those in charge, however, those who wrote the reports and influenced the treatment, was that of reprimand and punishment, with certain forms of medical treatment being threatened as punishment for failure to cooperate, where not cooperate might mean a refusal to obey an order, say, to go to the doorless lavatories with 6 others and urinate in public while suffering verbal abuse by the nurse for being unwilling. Too fussy, are we? Well, miseducated, you'll learn a thing or two here. Dear educated, miseducated, sadly, the fact of my having been to high school, training college and university struck a vein of vindictiveness. 25. Because of her extreme aversion to ECT, Frame was now treated largely with insulin therapy, as she had been at Avondale. But this time something worse was in store. In December 1952 she was informed by Cyril Burt, one of the young, overworked medical staff, that she had been selected for the dreaded prefrontal lobotomy operation, known in the United States as lobotomy, which severed the fibers connecting the front part of the brain to the rest of the cerebral cortex. Dr. Burt told her that it would be good for me, that, following it, I would be out of hospital in no time. Frame heard this news with a swamping wave of horror. Also, with a feeling that my erasure was being completed. The ward sister, suddenly interested that something was about to be done with me and to me, painted a picture of how it would be when it was all over. We had one patient who was here for years until she had a lobotomy. And now she's selling hats in a hat shop. I saw her just the other day, selling hats, as normal as anyone. Wouldn't you like to be normal? Everyone felt that it was better for me to be normal, and not have fancy intellectual notions about being a writer, that it was better for me to be out of hospital, working at an ordinary occupation, mixing with others. 26. Frame was not convinced. There was only one person whose opinion she trusted on the matter. So she resumed her correspondence with John Money in order to express her fears about the operation, and to ask him, shall I still be able to write? Shall I still have the emotional urgency and need for writing? 27. Money replied from Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. The very fact that you could ask me the question with such detachment is evidence that it would not do much for you. At this hospital it is generally felt that lobotomy has not lived up to expectations. They do not perform it here. So if you have any choice in the matter, I would say no. 28. At Seacliff, however, the scene was set. Lottie Frame, as next of kin, had been persuaded to sign a letter of consent. I am quite sure you would not decline permission for an operation likely to benefit your daughter, one doctor had written to her. Point 29. The letter said that Janet Patterson Frame, having failed to maintain a good level of response to the ordinary physical methods of treatment, is deemed to be a suitable subject for prefrontal lobotomy operation to which I hereby give my consent. I understand to what extent this operation may offer a measure of relief and the minor element of risk involved. 30. It is unlikely that Mrs. Frame understood any such thing. There was controversy within the medical profession about the efficacy and risks of lobotomies, and Jeffrey Blake Palmer's predecessor as superintendent at Seacliff had believed that they achieved beneficial results only in a limited number of cases. 31 The risks were that patients would be left vegetative, or that their depressions or obsessions intensified. There was an eventual consensus that the harmful effects outweighed likely benefits. 32 But this was a decade away. In December 1952, Janet Frame was on Seacliff Hospital's operation list. It was Frame's writing, not John Money's postal intervention, that saved her. Lottie Frame's consent was signed on December 20th, Frame's plea to Money on December 24th. On December 26th, within days of the scheduled surgery, newspapers around the country carried a story headed, "Writer Wins Prize for Prose." The New Zealand Centre of the Writers' Organisation, 10 announces that the Hubert Church Memorial Award for Prose has been won by Miss Janet Frame of Oamaru for her book, Lagoon and Other Stories. 33 The prize, worth £25, was at that time the country's major literary award for prose. Frank Sargison had won it the previous year. To those in the know, it represented a prestigious honor. 34. One such initiate was hospital superintendent Jeffrey Blake Palmer. He came into the day room of Frame's ward brandishing a copy of the Dunedin Evening Star. He told her about the award, she had never heard of it, and that, because of it, she would be taken off the operation list. "I've decided that you should stay as you are. I don't want you changed." 35 There would be no lobotomy for her, and she would be moved to a more open ward. This decision, combined with the attentions of John Stenhouse, a doctor recently arrived from Scotland, resulted in drastic changes in Frame's circumstances. "I was, now, treated as a person of some worth, a human being, in spite of the misgivings and unwillingness of some members of the staff, who, like certain relatives when a child is given attention, warn the mother that the child is being spoiled, spoke pessimistically and perhaps enviously of my being, made a fuss of." 36 This was no exaggeration. When Frame was again allowed the use of her typewriter, for example, her hospital notes record that the various concessions have been made, and she is rapidly becoming a law unto herself. 37. Relief at her own deliverance was undercut by the fact that a friend was not so fortunate. Audrey Scrivener, a fellow patient, was the daughter of Frame's teacher's college lecturer in nature study and agriculture, Len Scrivener. She had been committed to Seacliff in the belief that her asthma was psychosomatic in origin. At Seacliff her asthma worsened and she became severely depressed. She was scheduled for brain surgery at the same time as Frame, and she was not rescued by the award of a literary prize. Scrivener had her lobotomy and was returned to the hospital, where, among the group known as the lobotomies, some attempt was made to continue, with personal attention, the process of being made normal. They were talked to, taken for walks, puttied with makeup and floral scarves covering their shaven heads. They were silent, docile, their eyes were large and dark and their faces pale, with damp skin. They were being retrained to fit in to the everyday world, always described as outside. In the whirlwind of work and the shortage of staff and the too slow process of retraining, the lobotomies one by one became the casualties of withdrawn attention and interest. The fall spring turned once again to winter. 38. When Frame eventually left Seacliff, Audrey Scrivener remained, and she was in and out of psychiatric hospitals for the rest of her life. Cruelly, the asthma which had been the initial cause of her illness was worse, not better, after the lobotomy. Although she was formerly aware of and interested in things of the mind, Frame wrote, now she sits and knits. 39 Scrivener also now communicated, in speech and by letter, with a dogged, pedestrian determination. Frame, feeling a sense of guilt that she had escaped the operation while her friend had not, corresponded with Scrivener until her death in 1973. The legacy of her dehumanizing change remains, with all who knew her, Frame would say after that death. I have it with me always. 40. At the end of November, Frame was again home at Willowglen, from where she wrote to Charles Brash on December 9th that she had become ill and been forced to leave the Grand Hotel. 69 5 days later she had herself readmitted to Seacliff Hospital as a voluntary boarder. On her application form she gave her occupation as waitress. Her reason for seeking admission, she wrote in characteristically elusive and elusive terms, was, as I was walking on the stair, I met a thing that wasn't there. It wasn't there again today. I wish the thing would go away. 70. Hospital authorities took this to be an admission of hallucinations, consistent with her schizophrenia. She is fully volitional, and retains a surprising degree of insight, her notes recorded. But she has become fearful, and it is largely because of this fear and feelings of panic that she seeks asylum. 71. This time, unlike the periods following previous hospital admissions, Frame made a steady recovery. She avoided ECT and insulin therapy and was simply prescribed a new antipsychotic drug. Her hospital records chart rapid progress. Good rapport obtained. Clean and neat in appearance. Pleasant and cooperative. Is brighter, somewhat more outgoing. Plays basketball and mixes a lot with others. She has again started to write, having obtained her typewriter from home. Finally, discharged, relieved. She proposes to return home and carry on her literary activities. 72. On March 1, 1955, Frame walked out of Seacliff Hospital for the last time and caught the northbound train to Amaru. Her intention to return home was stated only to facilitate her release from hospital. In fact, she remained at Willowglen for the briefest time possible. Aware that family stresses had triggered previous relapses in her health, and oppressed by her parents' expectation that she would be the daughter who stayed with them and cared for them as they declined into ill health and old age, a final subtraction which I could not bear to face, 73. Frame determined to break the pattern decisively. She would accept her sister and brother-in-law's invitation to return to Auckland. Her efforts to obtain a sickness benefit on release from Seacliff, to allow her to write uninterruptedly, had been frustrated by Dr. Blake Palmer. He would never agree to that, he said. While he hoped that she would continue to write as a gifted amateur, it was even more important for her full recovery that she not risk losing the habit of working. 74. That being the case, Frame determined, she would abandon waitressing to work as a housemaid only, where I could spend my time on my own with my own thoughts, moving from room to room, making beds, dusting, polishing, without the daily conflict with cooks. 75. And so it unfolded, or began to unfold. Frame bought her parents an electric blanket to help them through the awful winter, then had a formal photographic portrait taken, a kind of reinstating of myself as a person. 76. With the rest of her savings she bought her fares to Auckland. In mid-March she travelled by train to Christchurch, ferry to Wellington, where she stayed with her Uncle Veer and Auntie Polly Curtis, and train again to Auckland. Suddenly, there was, up north again, the blue paradisal air and light. 77. There too were June and Wilson Gordon and their 3 children. A daughter, Pamela, had been born in August 1954. They were still on the north shore of the Waitemata Harbour but had moved to Northcote. Within days of her arrival, Frame had found a live-in job as a housemaid at the Trans-Tasman Hotel in the city. But it was not quite as she had expected. Unlike the Grand Hotel, with its family atmosphere, there were many rooms, many floors, a large staff and a sense of urgency about every activity. People, unsmiling, spoke briskly, abruptly. I was given a floor to myself and the usual duties of bed-making, room dusting and cleaning of the corridors and bathrooms, with my own quarters, a tiny room upstairs in what was called the Gods. I soon discovered that many of the guests on my floor were pilots and passengers, from the early morning Pan American flights, who stayed in bed until late afternoon, and it was on one of these afternoons when I was still struggling with unmade beds and uncleaned rooms when I should long ago have finished, that the housekeeper discovered me and threatened to sack me if I could not work faster. I burst into tears, and that evening I left the Trans-Tasman. I had survived only 1 week. Auckland was a real city, a harsh city like those I had read about. 78. Frame returned to Northcote, where the Gordons had just built a new home on a bush-clad slope above mangrove flats on the edge of the Waitemata Harbour. For a week she devoted time to getting to know June, Wilson, and their 3 children. Then, at the weekend, they went for a drive, supposedly to see the sights of Auckland's North Shore. It was in the course of that outing that Frame met Frank Sargison. And that meeting would deflect her life onto yet another trajectory. This time, it would be one with which she would find herself wholly in accord. Time confers privileges of arrangement and rearrangement undreamed of until it becomes time past. I have been writing of the memory of publication of stories and poems. In actual memory I am sitting talking to 2 Borstal girls, on the way to Seacliff Hospital, where I shall be a committed patient. 1945, 4. The 6 weeks I spent at Seacliff Hospital in a world I'd never known among people whose existences I never thought possible, became for me a concentrated course in the horrors of insanity and the dwelling place of those judged insane, separating me forever from the former acceptable realities and assurances of everyday life. From my first moment there I knew that I could not turn back to my usual life or forget what I saw at Seacliff. I felt as if my life were overturned by this sudden division of people into ordinary people in the street, and these secret people whom few had seen or talked to but whom many spoke of with derision, laughter, fear. I saw people with their eyes staring like the eyes of hurricanes surrounded here by whirling unseen and unheard commotion contrasting strangely with the stillness. I grew to know and like my fellow patients. I was impressed and saddened by our capacity to learn and adhere to and often relish the spoken and unspoken rules of institutional life, by the pride in the daily routine, shown by patients who had been in hospital for many years. There was a personal geographical, even linguistic exclusiveness in this community of the insane, who yet had no legal or personal external identity, no clothes of their own to wear, no handbags, purses, no possessions but a temporary bed to sleep in with a locker beside it, and a room to sit in and stare, called the day room. Many patients confined in other wards of Seacliff had no name, only a nickname, no past, no future, only an imprisoned now, an eternal island without its accompanying horizons, foot or handhold, and even without its ever-changing sky. In my book Faces in the Water I have described in detail the surroundings and events in the several mental hospitals I experienced during the 8 following years. I have also written factually of my own treatment and my thoughts about it. The fiction of the book lies in the portrayal of the central character, based on my life but given largely fictional thoughts and feelings, to create a picture of the sickness I saw around me. When one day a fellow patient, seeing workmen outside digging drains, said to me, "Look, they are digging our graves," I knew she believed this. Her words are an example of the words and behavior I used to portray as Stina Mavit. Even in my 6-week stay I learned, as if I had entered a foreign land, much of the language and behavior of the inhabitants of the land. Others also learned fast. The girls from Borstal were adept at livening their day by a performance based on example. My previous community had been my family. Into the island I constantly used the first-person plural, we, not I. My time as a student was an I time. Now, as a Seacliff patient, I was again part of a group, yet more deeply alone, not even a creviced I. I became, she, one of them. When I left Seacliff in December 1945, for a 6-month probationary period, to return to a Willowglen summer, the shiningest time at Willowglen, I thought that I carried within me a momentous change brought about by my experience of being in a mental hospital. I looked at my family and I knew that they did not know what I had seen, that in different places throughout the country there were men and women and children locked, hidden away with nothing left but a nickname, with even the word nickname hinting at the presence of devils. I noticed that the behavior of my family had changed in subtle ways related to my having been a patient in Seacliff where the loonies lived. Why do I use once again the metaphor with a spider? It seemed as if, having been in hospital, I had, like a spider, woven about me numerous threads which invisibly reached all those who we knew, and bound them to a paralysis of fixed poses and expressions and feelings that made me unhappy and lonely but gave me also a recognition of the power of having spun the web and the powerlessness of those trapped within it. When I'd been home a week or 2 my family grew less apprehensive in my presence. The change showed in the lessening of fear in their eyes. Who knew what I might do? I was a loony, wasn't I? Mother, characteristically, began to deny everything. I was a happy person, she said. There must have been some mistake. I found that everyone was pleased when I treated the matter as a joke, talking of amusing incidents at the country estate, likening it to a hotel. I described the surroundings. It's like a whole village, I said. They have their own farm, their own cattle and pigs, and all the waste from the foods goes into the pig tin. They have their vegetable garden, and their flowers, too. And the grounds are full of trees, and there's a magnolia tree near where the superintendent lives. It was easier to talk as if I were a child describing what I had seen and what adventures I'd had on my holiday. I didn't tell them how I had peeped through the fence of a building called Simla, away upon the hill, where there were strange men in striped shirts and trousers and some without trousers, walking round and round in a paddock with the grass worn away, and how I'd seen a paddock of women, too, wearing the dark blue striped clothes, and how there was a cart, like a rickshaw, that passed every day by the ward, how it was full of coal and 2 men harnessed to the cart carried the coal, driven by one of the attendants, how, curious as ever, I had peered into a room that stank of urine and was full of children lying in cots, strange children, some of them babies, making strange noises, their faces wet with tears and snot, and I didn't say how there was a special section for the patients with tuberculosis, and how their dishes were boiled in a kerosene tin on the dining room fire, and the nurses spent some time in the small linen cupboard folding the cardboard to make the daily supply of boxes, like strawberry boxes, for the TB patients to spit in. After Christmas it was suggested that perhaps a holiday would be good for me, and so June and I set out for 2 weeks in Picton, Mother's old hometown, where we spent the usual summer sandfly-bitten time traveling around the sounds and launches, meeting relatives, hearing new details of family history, while I, strongly under the influence of my past year of listening to music, composed in my mind what I called my Picton Symphony in green and blue. My memory of the holiday is scattered, like seeds, I imagine, a handful eaten by summer visiting birds migrating from winter memories, or by native birds that feed time-long on the memory, others not surviving, others grown into plants that cannot be recognized or named. I know that I took home the memory of those steep green oppressive hills, their bush-clad slopes rising as inescapably close as neighbors. Asked to describe the holiday, June and I told the family what we knew they wanted to hear, to try to make everyone happy. We had grown up, you see, in a thorough school, in this with our mother as teacher. And once again I began to prepare for another year in Dunedin. I planned to find a live-in job, and to take philosophy too, logic and ethics, but sit no examinations. I had been assured that although I sat no end-of-year psychology examinations, I would be granted a pass based on my year's work. Perhaps I neglected to fill in the correct forms. I discovered that I had been marked failed. Failed. In the meantime, at home, there was the problem of having my life savings of £20 returned from the public trust office, who had taken charge of my affairs as I was officially insane. Once again my sisters and my brother and I banded together to try to assert our rights, with Isabel composing an earnest letter to the public trust officer, who replied that his confiscation of my property was in my own interests as I was officially insane and would not have legal rights until my probation period of 6 months had ended, and then only if the doctor declared my sanity. Perhaps, then, I could be given a sickness benefit until I began working again. My visit to the Seacliff doctor at the Almaru Hospital brought its own bewilderment, for the medical certificate stated, nature of illness, schizophrenia. At home I announced, half with pride, half with fear, I've got schizophrenia. I searched through my psychology book, the chapter on abnormal psychology, where I found no reference to schizophrenia, only to a mental illness apparently afflicting only young people like myself, dementia praecox, described as a gradual deterioration of mind, with no cure. In the notes at the end of the chapter there was an explanation that dementia praecox was now known as schizophrenia. Schizophrenia. A gradual deterioration of mind. Of mind and behavior. I suffered from schizophrenia. It seemed to spell my doom, as if I had emerged from a chrysalis, the natural human state, into another kind of creature, and even if there were parts of me that were familiar to human beings, my gradual deterioration would lead me further and further away, and in the end not even my family would know me. In the last of the shining Willow Glen summer these feelings of doom came only briefly as passing clouds blocked the sun. I knew that I was shy, inclined to be fearful, and even more so after my 6 weeks of being in hospital and seeing what I had seen around me, that I was absorbed in the world of imagination. But I also knew that I was totally present in the real world, and whatever shadow lay over me, lay only in the writing on the medical certificate. Towards the opening of the university year, when I advertised for a live-in job in Dunedin, describing myself as a research student, I received a reply from Mrs. B, of Playfair Street, Caversham, who kept a boarding house and cared for elderly women. I was to be a housemaid waitress nurse, with £3 a week, all found, and afternoons free. Afternoons free. Time to write my stories and poems. The boarding house and the new world. Once again I traveled south by the slow Sunday train to Dunedin, stopping at every station, looking out from the old-fashioned carriage, tacked on for the few passengers, at the spiraling links of tarpaulin-covered trucks. As usual there were unloadings, loadings, jolts as the trucks were removed, long periods when the carriage at the end seemed to stand alone in the midst of paddocks of gum trees, tussock, manuka scrub, mataguri, swamp, sheep, derelict houses, as if it made an excursion into a nowhere that was also a yesterday, filled with peace and sadness. I looked out of the old-fashioned push-up window, as opposed to the newer wind-up windows of the express trains, and I felt a force that could only have been the force of love drawing me towards the land, where no one appeared to be home. I felt a new sense of responsibility to everything and everyone because every moment I carried the memory of the people I had seen in Seacliff, and this knowing even changed the landscape and my feeling towards it. When the train stopped at Seacliff Station, I saw the few parole patients waiting on the platform to watch the train go by. I knew, you see. Inwardly I kept describing myself in the words that I knew relatives and friends now used, she's been in Seacliff. They had to take her to Seacliff. And I thought of the horror in Mother's voice when, years ago, the doctor had suggested that Buddy should go there, and Mother had replied, never. Never. No child of mine will ever go to that place. But I was a child of hers, wasn't I? Wasn't I? And she had signed papers to send me there. I felt uneasy, trying to divide out portions of family love to discover how much was mine. I looked around the carriage at the ordinary people. Did they know where I had been? If they knew, would they look at me and then turn away quickly to hide the fear and fascinated curiosity as if they were tasting an experience which, thank God, they thought, they would never know but about which they wondered furiously, fearfully? If they knew about me, would they try to find a sign, as I had done when I, too, used to stare at the balloonies on Seacliff Station? Well, I thought, the signs were often secret but I knew them now. I was an experienced observer. I had visited the foreign land. Also, I remembered with dread, they say I have schizophrenia. A disease without hope. The wheels of the train, however, which all my railway life had said, Kaitangada, 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 remained uninfluenced by my strange disease. Their iron on iron said, obstinately, Kaitangada, Kaitangada, Kaitangada. The train arrived at Dunedin Station. I felt quite alone, as if I belonged nowhere. All those marvelously belonging days at training college when we sang, the deacon went down, and talked knowledgeably of party, and crit lessons, and days of control, the English and French lectures, the year of teaching children I had grown to love, had vanished as if they had never been, an impression deepened by the fact that since my disappearance to Seacliff there'd been no word from college or school or university, except a letter from my friend Sheila and a note from John Forrest to invite me to have little talks with him during the coming year. I clung to the idea of having someone to talk to, and relished the bonus that the someone was an interesting young man. I was taking my new status seriously. If the world of the mad were the world where I now officially belonged, lifelong disease, no cure, no hope, then I would use it to survive, I would excel in it. I sensed that it did not exclude my being a poet. It was therefore with a feeling of loneliness but with a new self-possession, unlike my first fearful arrival in the big city of Dunedin, that I took a taxi to Playfair Street, Caversham, in the heart of the country of the industrial school. South Dunedin, Kensington, Caversham, St Kilda, was a poor community where lives were spent in the eternal toil, with the low-lying landscape reflecting the lives, as if effort and hope were here washed away in the recurring floods while the dwellers on the hill's suburbs prospered. I had taught in Caversham School and at Kensington in the school under the railway bridge, and I had seen the poverty, the rows of decaying houses washed biscuit color by time and the rain and the floods, and the pale children like-haired, damp-looking, as if they emerged each day from the tide. My memory of the boarders and the landlord and landlady and their child is momentary, like a hastily sketched scene in black and white giving only the outline of each person with the hair growing like grass out of their skull. They still hold, however, an invisible bowl brimful of feeling, and it is their feeling unspoken and spoken, that I remember most vividly. They were unhappy, anxious people trying desperately to pretend they were happy, and seizing occasions of joy to recount, each to the others, at mealtimes, as a way of contributing to the possibility of happiness. The men usually were employed at the railway workshops, the women in the factories, the chocolate or jam factory, or a branch of the woolen mill. One young man lost his job every few weeks, found another, lost that, and at night, at dinner, the others talked about his success or failure, explaining, excusing, condemning. They criticized each other, poked fun, pounced swiftly on me unconforming. I remember the landlady's husband only as a tall, pale, stooped man who carried firewood from a shed into the sitting room, where everyone gathered in the evening, the women with their knitting, the men with playing cards or their sporting newspapers, and sometimes one of the boarders who was acknowledged to have failed in life, as opposed to the others who still had valid excuses and reasons, a thin woman in her middle 30s, without a husband or lover, the basis for her being judged a failure, played the yellowing keys of the piano while the middle-aged bachelor, a salesman, plump, popular, he's always the same, you know where you are with him, sang the current favorite song. Beyond the sunset. To blissful morning. From the moment of my arrival I explained that I'd be very busy out of working hours and so would prefer at times to have my meals in my room. I was a student, engaged in private research, I said, with my ready smile, hoping that I concealed my badly decayed teeth, sympathetic voice, no obvious physical deformities, and my upstanding mass of frizzy ginger hair. My duties were to prepare and serve breakfast, to clean the house, and to attend to the 4 elderly women who lived, bedridden, each in a corner bed, in the large front room. I washed them, helped to turn them or arrange the rubber ring beneath their gaunt bodies where the skin hung in folds like chicken skin with bumps where feathers might once have been. I rubbed methylated spirits on their bedsores, and powdered their bodies. I fed them, sometimes with the aid of a white china feeding cup. I helped them use the wooden commode or arranged a bedpan beneath their drooping buttocks. I was cold. I tried to find a pair of long woolen ward socks to keep my feet warm in order that I should not die under the new treatment, electric shock therapy, and have my body sneaked out the back way to the mortuary. Every morning I woke in dread, waiting for the day nurse to go on her rounds and announce from the list of names in her hand whether or not I was for shock treatment, the new and fashionable means of quieting people and of making them realize that orders are to be obeyed and floors are to be polished without anyone protesting and faces are made to be fixed into smiles and weeping is a crime. Waiting in the early morning, in the black-capped frosted hours, was like waiting for the pronouncement of a death sentence. I tried to remember the incidents of the day before. Had I wept? Had I refused to obey an order from one of the nurses? Or, becoming upset at the sight of a very ill patient, had I panicked and tried to escape? Had a nurse threatened, if you don't take care you'll be for treatment tomorrow? Day after day I spent the time scanning the faces of the staff as carefully as if they were radar screens which might reveal the approach of the fate that had been prepared for me. I was cunning. Let me mop the office, I pleaded. Let me mop the office in the evenings, for by evening the film of germs has settled on your office furniture and report books, and if the danger is not removed you might fall prey to disease which means disquietude and fingerprints and a sewn shroud of cheap cotton. So I mopped the office, as a precaution, and sneaked across to the sister's desk and glanced quickly at the open report book and the list of names for treatment the next morning. One time I read my name there, Estina Mavitt. What had I done? I hadn't cried or spoken out of turn or refused to work the bumper with the polishing rag under it or to help set the tables for tea, or to carry out the overflowing pig tin to the side door. There was obviously a crime which was unknown to me, which I had not included in my list because I could not track it with the swinging spotlight of my mind to the dark hinterland of unconsciousness. I knew then that I would have to be careful. I would have to wear gloves, to leave no trace when I burgled a crammed house of feeling and took for my own use exuberance, depression, suspicion, terror. As we watched the day nurse moving from one patient to another with the list in her hand, our sick dread became more intense. You're for treatment. No breakfast for you. Keep on your nightgown and dressing gown and take your teeth out. We had to be careful, calm, controlled. If our forebodings were unwarranted we experienced a dizzy lightness and relief which, if carried too far, made us liable to be given emergency treatment. If our name appeared on the fateful list we had to try with all our might, at times unsuccessfully, to subdue the rising panic. For there was no escape. Once the names were known all doors were scrupulously locked. We had to stay in the observation dormitory where the treatment was being held. It was a time of listening to the other patients walking along the corridor for breakfast, the silence as Sister Honey, her head bowed, her eyes watchfully open, said grace. For what you are about to receive the Lord make you truly thankful. And then we heard the sudden cheerful clatter of spoons on porridge plates, the scraping of chairs, the disconcerted murmur at the end of the meal when the inevitably missing knife was being searched for while the sister warned sternly, "Let no one leave the table until the knife is found." Then further scraping and rustling following the sister's orders. "Rise, ladies." Side doors being unlocked as the patients were ordered to their separate places of work. "Laundry, ladies." "Sewing room, ladies." "Nurse's home, ladies." Then the pegging footsteps as the massive matron glass on her tiny black-shod feet approached down the corridor, unlocked the observation dormitory and stood surveying us, with a query to the nurse, like a stockman appraising head of cattle waiting in the sale yards to go by truck to the slaughterhouse. "They're all here? Make sure they have nothing to eat." We stood in small groups, waiting, or crouched in a semicircle around the great locked fireplace where a heap of dull coals smoldered sulkily, our hands on the blackened bars of the fireguard, to warm our nipped fingers. For in spite of the snapdragons and the dusty millers and the cherry blossoms, it was always winter. And it was always our season of peril, electricity, the peril the wind sings to in the wires on a gray day. Time after time I thought, what safety measures must I apply to protect myself against electricity? And I listed the emergencies: lightning, riots, earthquakes, and the measures provided for the world by man's Red Cross God safety to whom we owe allegiance or die on the separated ice floe, in double loneliness. But it would not come to my mind what to do when I was threatened by electricity, except that I thought of my father's rubber hip boots that he used for fishing and that stood in the wash house where the moth-eaten coats hung behind the door, beside the pile of old humor magazines, the finest selections of the world's wit, for reading in the lavatory. Where was the wash house and the old clothes with spiders' nests and with mice in their folds? Lost in a foreign land, take your position from the creeks flowing towards the sea, and your time from the sun. Yes, I was cunning. I remembered once a relationship between electricity and wetness, and on the excuse of going to the lavatory I filled the admission bath and climbed in, wearing my nightgown and dressing gown, and thinking, now they will not give me treatment, and perhaps I may have a secret influence over the sleek cream-painted machine with its knobs and meters and lights. Do you believe in a secret influence? There had been occasions of delirious relief when the machine broke down and the doctor emerged, frustrated, from the treatment room, and Sister Honey made the welcome proclamation, "You can all get dressed." No treatment today. But this day when I climbed in the bath the secret influence was absence, and I was given treatment, hurried into the room as the first patient, even before the noisy people from Ward 2, the disturbed ward, were brought in for multiples, which means they were given 2 treatments and sometimes 3, consecutively. These excited people in their red ward dressing gowns and long grey ward stockings and bunchy striped bloomers which some took care to display to us, were called by their Christian names or nicknames, Dizzy, Goldie, Dora. Sometimes they approached us and began to confide in us or touch our sleeves, reverently, as if we were indeed what we felt ourselves to be, a race apart from them. Were we not that ostensibly ill who did not yet substitute animal noises for speech or fling our limbs in uncontrolled motion or dissolve into secret silent hilarity? And yet when the time of treatment came and they and we were ushered or dragged into the room at the end of the dormitory, all of us, whether from the disturbed ward or the good ward, uttered the same kind of stifled choking scream when the electricity was turned on and we dropped into immediate lonely unconsciousness. It was early in my dream. The tracks of time crossed and merged, and with the head-on collision of hours of fire broke out, blackening the vegetation that sprouts a green memory along the side of the track. I took a thimbleful of water distilled from the sea and tried to extinguish the fire. I waved a small green flag in the face of the oncoming hours and they passed through the scarred countryside to their destination, and as the faces peered from the window at me I saw they were the faces of the people awaiting shock treatment. There was Miss Caddy, they called her, bickering and suspicious, not knowing that she would soon die and her body be sneaked out the back way to the mortuary. And there was my own face staring from the carriageful of the nicknamed people in their ward clothes, striped smocks and grey woolen jerseys. What did it mean? I was so afraid. When I first came to Cliffhaven and walked into the day room and saw the people sitting and staring, I thought, as a passerby in the street thinks when you see someone staring into the sky, if I look up too, I will see it. And I looked but I did not see it. And the staring was not, as it is in the streets, an occasion for crowds who share the spectacle. It was an occasion of loneliness, of vision on a closed, private circuit. And it is still winter. Why is it winter when the cherry blossom is in flower? I have been here in Cliffhaven for years now. How can I get to school by 9 o'clock if I am trapped in the observation dormitory waiting for ECT? It is such a long way to go to school, down Eden Street past Ribble Street and D Street past the doctor's house and their little girl's dollhouse standing on the lawn. I wish I had a dollhouse. I wish I could make myself small and live inside it, curled up in a matchbox with satin bed curtains and gold stars painted on the striking side, for good conduct. There is no escape. Soon it will be time for ECT. Through the veranda windows I can see the nurses returning from second breakfast, and the sight of them walking in 2s and 3s past the border of Snapdragon's granny's bonnets and the cherry blossom tree brings a sick feeling of despair and finality. I feel like a child who has been forced to eat a strange food in a strange house and you must spend the night there in a strange room with a different smell on the bedclothes and different borders on the blankets, and waken in the morning to the sight of a different and terrifying landscape from the window. The nurses enter the dormitory. They collect false teeth from the treatment patients, plunging them in water in old cracked cups and writing the names on the outside in pale blue ink from a ballpoint pen. The ink slips on the impenetrable china surface and spreads, blurring from itself, with the edges of the letters appearing like the microfilm of flies' feet. A nurse brings 2 small chipped enamel bowls of methylated spirits and ethereal soap, to rub up our temples in order that the shock will take. I try to find a pair of gray woolen socks for if my feet are cold I know that I shall die. One patient is careful to put on her pants, in case I kick up my legs in front of the doctor. At the last minute, as the feel of 9 o'clock surrounds us and we sit in the high chairs, our heads tipped back, the soaked cotton will being rubbed on our temples until the skin tears and stings and the dregs of the spirits run down into our ears making sudden blockages of sound. There is a final outbreak of screaming and panicking, attempts by some to grab leftover food from the dead patients, and as a nurse calls lavatory, ladies, and the dormitory door is opened for a brief supervised visit to the doorless lavatories, with guards set in the corridor to prevent escape. There are bursts of fighting and kicking as some attempt to get past, yet realizing almost at once that there is nowhere to run to. The doors to the outside world are locked. You can only be followed and dragged back, and if Matron Glass catches you she will speak angrily. It's for your own good. Pull yourself together. You've been difficult long enough. The matron herself does not offer to undergo shock treatment in the way that suspected persons to prove their innocence are sometimes willing to take the first slice of the cake that may contain arsenic. Floral screens are drawn to conceal the end of the dormitory where the treatment beds have been prepared, the sheets rolled back and the pillows placed at an angle, ready to receive the unconscious patient. And now everybody wants to go again to the lavatory, and again, as the panic grows, and the nurse locks the door for the last time, and the lavatory is inaccessible. We yearn to go there, and sit on the cold china bowls and in the simplest way try to relieve ourselves of the mounting distress in our minds, as if a process of the body could change the distress and flush it away as burning drops of water. And now there is the sound of an early morning catarrhal cough, the spinning squeak of rubber-soled shoes on the polished corridor outside, syncopated with the hasty ping-pong steps of Cuban-heeled duty shoes, and Dr. Howell and Matron Glass arrive, she unlocking the dormitory door and standing aside while he enters, and both passing in royal procession to join Sister Honey already waiting in the treatment room. At the last minute, because there are not enough nurses, the newly appointed social worker who has been asked to help with treatment comes leaping in. We call her Pavlova. Nurse, will you send up the first patient? Many times I have offered to go first because I like to remind myself that by the time I am awake, so brief is the period of unconsciousness, most of the group will still be waiting in a daze of anxiety which sometimes confuses them into thinking that perhaps they have had treatment, perhaps it has been sneaked upon them without their being aware of it. The people behind the screen begin to moan and cry. We are taken strictly according to rules. We wait while the ward 2 people are done. We know the rumors attached to ECT. It is training for Sing Sing when we are at last convicted of murder and sentenced to death and sit strapped in the electric chair with the electrodes touching our skin through slits in our clothing. Our hair is singed as we die and the last smell in our nostrils is the smell of ourselves burning. And the fear leads in some patients to more madness. And they say it is a session to get you to talk, that your secrets are filed and kept in the treatment room, and I have had proof of this, for I have passed through the treatment room with a basket of dirty linen, and see my card. Impulsive and dangerous, it reads. Why? And how? How? What does it all mean? It is merely my turn. I walk down to the treatment room door to wait, for so many treatments have to be performed that the doctor becomes impatient at any delay. Production, as it were, is speeded up, like laundry economics. One set of clothes on, one set clean, one in the wash, if there is a patient waiting at the door, one on the treatment table, and another being given a final rub-up ready to take her place at the door. Suddenly the inevitable cry or scream sounds from behind the closed doors, which after a few minutes swing open and Molly or Goldie or Mrs. Gregg, convulsed and snorting, is wheeled out. I close my eyes tight as the bed passes me, yet I cannot escape seeing it, or the other beds where people are lying, perhaps heavily asleep, or whimperingly awake, their faces flushed, their eyes bloodshot. I can hear someone moaning and weeping. It is someone who has woken up in the wrong time and place, for I know that the treatment snatches these things from you, leaves you alone and blind in the nothingness of being, and you try to fumble your way like a newborn animal to the floor in of first comforts. Then you wake, small and frightened, and the tears keep falling in a grief that you cannot name. Beside me is the bed, sheets turned back, pillow arranged where I will lie after treatment. They will lift me into it and I shall not know. I look at the bed as if I must establish contact with it. Few people have advanced glimpses of their coffin. If they did, they might be tempted to charm it into preserving in the satin lining a few trinkets of their identity. In my mind, I slip under the pillow of my treatment bed a docket of time and place so that when and if I ever wake I shall not be wholly confused in a panic of scrabbling through the darkness of not knowing and of being nothing. I go into the room then. How brave I am. Everybody remarks on my bravery. I climb onto the treatment table. I try to breathe deeply and evenly as I have heard it is wise in moments of fear. I try not to mind when the matron whispers to one of the nurses, in a hoarse voice like an assassin, "Have you got the gag?" And over inside myself I am saying a poem which I learned at school when I was 8. I say the poem, as I wear the grey woolen socks, to ward off death. They are not relevant lines because very often the law of extremity demands an attention to irrelevancies. The dying man wonders what they will think when they cut his toenails. The man in grief counts the cups in a flower. I see the face of Miss Swab who taught us the poem. I see the mole on the side of her nose, its 2 mounds like a miniature cottage loaf and the sprout of ginger hair growing out the top. I see myself standing in the classroom reciting and feeling the worn varnished desk top jutting against my body against my belly button that has specks of grit in it when I put my finger in. I see from the corner of my left eye my neighbor's pencil case which I coveted because it was a triple-decker with a rose design on the lid and a wonderful dent thumb size for sliding the lid along the groove. Moonlit apples, I say. By John Drinkwater. At the top of the house the apples are laid in rows. And the skylight lets the moonlight in and those apples are deep-sea apples of green. I get no further than 3 lines. The doctor busily attending the knobs and switches of the machine which he respects because it is his ally in the struggle against overwork and the difficulties, depressions, obsessions, manias of 1,000 women, has time to smile a harassed good morning before he gives the signal to Matron Glass. "Close your eyes," Matron says. But I keep them open, observing the secretive signal and engulfed with helplessness while the matron and 4 nurses and Pavlova press upon my shoulders and my knees and I feel myself dropping as if a trapdoor had opened into darkness. I imagine as I fall my eyes turning inward to face and confound each other with a separate truth which they prove without my help. Then I rise disembodied from the dark to grasp and attach myself like a homeless parasite to the shape of my identity and its position in space and time. At first I cannot find my way. I cannot find myself where I left myself. Someone has removed all trace of me. I am crying. A cup of sweet tea is being poured down my throat. I grasp the nurse's arm. "Have I had it? Have I had it?" "You have had treatment," she answers. "Now go to sleep. You are awake too early." But I am wide awake and the anxiety begins again to accumulate. Will I be for treatment tomorrow? After the doctor performed the last shock treatment of the morning he used to go with Matron Glass and Sister Honey for morning tea in Sister's office where he sat in the best chair brought in from the adjoining room called the mess room, where visitors were sometimes received. Dr. Howell drank from the special cup which was tied around the handle with red cotton to distinguish the staff cups from those of the patients, and thus prevent the interchange of diseases like boredom, loneliness, authoritarianism. Dr. Howell was young, catarrhal, plump, pale-faced. We called him Scone. short-sighted, sympathetic, overworked with his fresh enthusiasm quickly perishing under concentrated stress, like a new plane that is put in a testing chamber simulating the conditions of millions of miles of flying and in a few hours suffers the mental fatigue of years. The morning tea was followed at 11 o'clock by the ritual of rounds when, accompanied by the ubiquitous matron Glass and Sister Honey, both acting as go-betweens, interpreters, and pickets, Dr. Howell would enter the day room where the elderly ladies and those younger but not yet fit for work in the laundry or the sewing room or, higher on the social scale, the nurse's home, sat drearily turning over the pages of an old illustrated London News or a Women's Weekly, or knitting blanket squares. For the lepers, or doing fancy work under the supervision of the newly appointed occupational therapist who, it was rumored, much to the dismay of many of the 100 women in Ward 4, was having an affair with Dr. Howell. "Good morning. How are you today?" the doctor would pause sometimes to inquire, smiling in a friendly manner, but at the same time glancing hastily at his watch and perhaps wondering how in the hour before lunch he could possibly finish his rounds of all the women's wards and get back to his office to deal with correspondence and interviews with demanding, puzzled, and ashamed relatives. The patient chosen for conversation with the doctor would become so excited at this rare privilege that she sometimes didn't know what to say or else began a breathless account which was cut short by matron. "Now doctor's too busy to listen to that, Marion. You get on with your fancy work." And in an aside to the doctor the omnipotent matron would whisper, "She's been rather uncooperative lately. We've put her down for treatment tomorrow." The doctor would nod absent-mindedly, make a fatuous remark, and because of his intelligence immediately realize the fatuity and mentally step back from himself like a salesman who has slighted his own wares. He would point with an increase of eagerness to a tapestry or a ring of lazy-daisy stitch thrust before him by a proud patient. Then, giving a troubled, guilty glance around the day room, he would retreat for the door while Matron Glass and Sister Honey attended to the mechanics of his exit, unlocking and locking the door and keeping at bay those patients whose need to communicate to a sympathetic listener made them hurry forward in a last attempt to show their tapestry or hurl abuse or greet and demand with, "Hello doctor, when can I go home?" Sometimes, as if in defiance of Matron Glass and Sister Honey, Dr. Howell chose to isolate himself from them and leave the day room by the door which opened onto the spacious tree-filled Ward 4 park. Then matron and sister would stand looking with accusation at each other and with apprehension as the doctor moved away from them, as spiders might look when a so carefully webbed fly with one flick of his wings escapes. It was the youth of Dr. Howell which appealed to us. The other doctors who did not look after us but who were in charge of the hospital were gray-haired and elderly and hurried in and out of their offices down in front of the building like rats in and out of their hiding places, and they sat, in their work, with the same old chewed solutions littered about them, like nesting material. It was Dr. Howell who tried to spread the interesting news that mental patients were people and therefore might like occasionally to engage in the activities of people. Thus were born the evenings when we played cards, snap, old maid, donkey, and euchre, and ludo and snakes and ladders, with prizes awarded and supper afterwards. But where was the extra staff to supervise the activities? Pavlova, the one social worker for the entire hospital, valiantly attended a few social evenings held for men and women patients in the Ward 4 day room. She watched people mount ladders and slide down chutes and travel home on the red and blue squares of Ludo. She too was pleased when the climax of the evening came with the arrival of Dr. Howell in sports coat and soft shoes, with his corn-colored hair slicked down and his undoctorly laugh sounding loud and full. He was like a god. He joined in the games and threw the dice with the aplomb of a god hurling a thunderbolt. He put on the appropriate expression of dismay when he was ordered to slide down a chute, but you could see that he was a charmer even of bile-green cardboard snakes. And of people. He was Pavlova's god too, we knew that, but no amount of weeping about in her soiled white coat with the few bottom buttons undone could help her to steal Dr. Howell from the occupational therapist. Poor Pavlova. And poor Noreen, who was waiting for Dr. Howell to propose to her, although the only words he had even spoken to her were "How are you? Do you know where you are? Do you know why you are here?" Phrases which ordinarily would be hard to interpret as evidence of affection. But when you are sick you find in yourself a new field of perception where you make a harvest of interpretations which then provides you with your daily bread, your only food. So that when Dr. Howell finally married the occupational therapist, Noreen was taken to the disturbed ward. She could not understand why the doctor did not need her more than anyone else in the world, why he had betrayed her to marry someone whose only virtues seemed to be the ability to show patients who were not always interested how to weave scarves and make shadow stitch on muslin. It is said that when a prisoner is condemned to die, all clocks in the neighborhood of the death cell are stopped, as if the removal of the clock will cut off the flow of time and maroon the prisoner on a coast of timelessness where the moments, like breakers, rise and surge near but never touch the shore. But no death of an oceanographer ever stopped the sea flowing, and the condition of sea is its meeting with the land. And in the death cell time flows in as if all the cuckoo clocks, grandfather clocks, alarm clocks were striking simultaneously in the ears of the prisoner. Again and again when I think of Cliffhaven I play the time game, as if I have been condemned to die and the signals have been removed, yet I hear them striking in my ears, warning me that 9 o'clock, the time of treatment, is approaching and that I must find myself a pair of woolen socks in order that I shall not die. Or it is 11 o'clock and treatment is over and it is the early hours or years of my dream when I was not yet sitting in rainbow puddles in Ward 2 yard or tramping the Shorn Park inside the tall picket fence with its rusty nails sprouting from the top, their points to the sky. 11 o'clock. I remember 11 o'clock, the pleasant agony of trying to decide when plump pale-faced Mrs. Pilling ready with the laundry basket with the cheese-smelling tablecloth inside would ask me, "Will you come for the bread with me?" And at the same time anxious Mrs. Everett, who was detained in hospital, as they say, at the sovereign's pleasure, would appear with an empty milk jug and ask, "Will you come with me to collect the cream for the specials?" The prospect of 2 journeys at the same time beyond the locked doors was so full of delight that I dallied to savor the pleasure and to hold a debate with myself on the merits of bakery and separator room. Bread or cream? The bakery with Andy shoveling the trays of loaves like yeasted molars into the yawning oven, slicing our ward bread and tried to sing above the slicer a duet for baker and bread machine with incidental crusts, or perhaps inviting me into the back room to give me a pastry left over from the superintendent's party, or an advanced chunk of the currant-filled Sunday borstal cake. Or the walk up the hill to the farm, past the deserted dung-smelling cow sheds into the separator room where Ted had arranged the cream cans in order of importance the way we used as children to arrange cups, first in the class, second in the class, and so on, when we played school with them. First, the superintendent's can, well polished with no dents and no ridge of old cream inside the shoulders. Next, the can for the doctors, also cleaned. Then for the chief clerk, the farm manager and his family, the engineer matrons and head attendant, the attendants and nurses. Finally, the special patients who were too frail or suffered from tuberculosis and whose names appeared on a list pinned to the dining room wall. From a ward of 100 women, only 10 or 15 could be special enough to have cream. I remember my amazement and gratitude when for some weeks my name appeared on the list of specials, and I sat smugly at dinner while the nurse poured cream on my tapioca or rice or farina or bread pudding, Mondays, or Thursdays in season, baked apple. You know that I have been pretending. You know that it is 11 o'clock and I am not allowed to go for the bread or up the hill past the poplar trees and the broom bushes and the wattle to fetch the cream, that I am hiding in the linen cupboard, sitting on an apple box of firewood and crying and afraid to be seen crying in case I am written up for ECT. The linen cupboard is my favorite hiding place. It is scrubbed every morning by the TB nurse and the floor looks like the deck of a ship. From here I listen to Margaret, who has TB and whose hoarse whisper tells continually of the First World War. She pleads with anyone who passes in the corridor to help her to evict the enemy from her room. She has lived for many years in this room, seeing the sun only for a few hours on a summer afternoon when shafts of light maneuver their way through the rusted wire netting of the window to shine and set the motes dancing on the wall. Sometimes on an afternoon walk with the nurse you can see Margaret standing in the sunlit corner of her room. The sun seems to shine through her as if the texture of her bones were gossamer. Her face is without color, even without the 2 familiar fever spots on her cheeks, and her body is like a skeleton. Looking at her you think, she is dying. Yet she goes on living, year after year, while other consumptives more robust in appearance, Effie, Jane, die and their bodies are hastily and antiseptically dispatched to the mortuary which is at the back of the laundry, facing the greenhouse, surrounded by rows of flowers and vegetables, the hardy plants outside and, inside, the sensitive begonias in pots used for surrounding the piano when the blind man from the city comes to play. The mortuary is faceless. If it were built in proportion, to really house the dead, its size would swallow the greenhouse and the laundry and the boiler house and the big kitchen, perhaps the entire hospital. But it is small, unobtrusive, and begs that patients conform to the rule of loneliness by dying one at a time. In spite of the scrubbed appearance of the linen cupboard, the smell pervading it is of floor-polished boot polish, from the little used caked tins of black and brown kept inside the large dented biscuit tin which bears on its lid the earnest profile of George VI, wet-stained chipped wood whose smell leaves a parched block taste in the mouth, clinging wet linen, and the muffled iron smell of fresh linen on the shelves, able drawers, chemises, nightgowns, sheets, counterpanes, with their scroll of patriotic design, ache, onward, onward. Here are kept the TB masks and dishes and the cardboard sputum boxes as they are procured, unfolded, from the stores. The TBS, as part of their realistic occupational therapy, spend some of their time folding the boxes, tucking in the flaps, setting them upright with the ounces clearly marked on the side, like a kindergarten class engaged in constructing do-it-yourself coffins. Here are the cut-down kerosene tins where the used TB dishes are put to be boiled, for there is yet no sterilizer for them, on the open fire in the dining room. This process is supervised by Mrs. Everett and Mrs. Pilling, who share control of kitchen affairs and are responsible for the fire. It is Mrs. Pilling, the most trusted patient in the ward, who also arranges the making of toast over the open fire in the morning, the collecting of bread and cream, the carrying out to the side door of the full pig tin ready for the golden-haired pig boy to pick up on his way to the farm, driving the leisurely old cart horse. When the tin has been loaded on the back, he rummages through the food, bypassing the cold skilly bog of leftover porridge and reaching for the more appetizing dainties of discarded toast and sodden pieces of currant bun, all of which he stuffs hungrily in his mouth and, chewing contentedly, climbs again to the front of the cart and with a tug of the reins and a gee-up, sets the morose but patient horse on his way. Mrs. Pilling, in her undemonstrative silent manner, has an understanding with the pig boy, and though she recoils from his habits, she has a stolid tolerance and respect for other people's peculiarities and is inclined to act out of character herself in order to preserve someone else's individuality. She sometimes leaves a slice of staff cake on the pig tin. It seems that she has no husband, no children, no relatives. She never has visitors. She never speaks of her personal concerns. One is seldom aware that she has any. She has lived for many years in the hospital and has a small room at the end of the TB corridor. One is surprised on passing it to notice that it has a cozy appearance as far as that is possible in a room in a mental hospital. She is allowed to keep her overcoat. It hangs behind the door. There is a feminine smell of powder and clothes. At one time someone must have given her a potted plant. It now stands on a chair in one corner, and an old calendar of 5 years ago, presumably kept for its old-fashioned English country scene, hangs over the hole in the center of the door so that the nurses may not peep in at her in the night. She is allowed that privacy. Her sobriety, her apparent acceptance of a way of life that will continue until she dies, these frighten me. She seems like someone who could set up camp in a graveyard and continue to boil the billy, eat and sleep soundly, and perhaps spend the day polishing the tombstones or weeding the graves. One watches her for a ripple of herself as one watches an eternally calm lake for evidence of the rumored creature inhabiting perhaps deeper than ever plummet sounded. One needs a machine like a bathysphere to find Mrs. Pilling. A bathysphere of fear? Of love? In the beginning and the end her life is bread cream, building the dining room fire, making sure with Mrs. Everett, who also has a passion for polishing, that the copper tiern is given its daily shine, setting out the private cupboard food. Fruit, sweets, cakes, biscuits brought by visitors and not eaten during the Saturday and Sunday visiting hours are taken from the patients and locked in the private cupboard, and at tea time, depending on how much food has been stored for you, you find beside your place at the table a dish with your name on it containing perhaps 2 or 3 wrapped chocolates and orange and apple. Sometimes, because I seldom have visitors, I contrive to help Mrs. Pilling and the nurse and wait greedily for the expected moment when the nurse, arranging on a plate a glittering still life of chocolate, says suddenly, "Here, have one." I protest, "Oh no. They do not belong to me." The nurse answers according to plan, "No, this patient has bags and bags of food, it's going to waste." Guiltily I seize the chocolate, unwrap it, slowly smooth the wrinkles from the silver paper, take a small bite, testing for hardness, then, like a thief, like the cunning scrounger that I am, I eat it. In the same way, after visitors leave and the patients, depressed and agitated, talking about husband, home, children, are wandering around clutching their only visible and palpable remnants of visiting hour, their small collection of biscuits, sweets, fruit, then I, with nothing in my hand and trying calmly to answer the question, "Who came to see you?" will happen to appear in the most crowded corner of the day room, where I know I will be offered an orange or a peppermint or a biscuit. "You should keep them for yourself," I protest, greedily holding out my hand. There is no past, present, or future. Using tenses to divide time is like making chalk marks on water. I do not know if my experiences at Cliffhaven happened years ago, are happening now, or lie and wait for me in what is called the future. I know that the linen room was very often my sanctuary. I looked through its little dusty window upon the lower park and the lawns and trees and the distant blue strip of sea like sticky paper pasted edge to edge with the sky. I wept and wondered and dreamed the abiding dream of most mental patients, the world, outside, freedom, and foretaste too vividly the occasions I most feared, electric shock treatment, being shut in a single room at night, being sent to Ward 2, the disturbed ward. I dreamed of the world because it seemed the accepted thing to do, because I could not bear to face the thought that not all prisoners dream of freedom. The prospect of the world terrified me, a morass of despair, violence, death with a thin layer of glass spread upon the surface where love, a tiny crab with pincers and rainbow shell, walked delicately ever sideways but getting nowhere, while the sun, like one of those woolly balls we made at occupational therapy by winding orange wool on a circle of cardboard, rose higher in the sky, its tassels dropping with flame threatening every moment to melt the precarious highway of glass. And the people, giant patchworks of color with limbs missing and parts of their minds snipped off to fit them into the outline of the free pattern. I could not find my way from the dream. I had no means to escape from it. I was like a surgeon who at the moment of a delicate operation finds that his tray of instruments has been stolen, or, worse, twisted into unfamiliar shapes so that only he can realize their unfamiliarity while the team around the table, suspecting nothing, wait for him to make the first incision. How can he explain to them what they cannot understand because it is visible only to him? Dutifully I thought of the world, because I was beyond it. Who else will dream of it with longing? And at times I murmured the token phrase to the doctor, when can I go home, knowing that home was the place where I least desired to be. There they would watch me for signs of abnormality, like ferrets around a rabbit burrow waiting for the rabbit to appear. I feared the prospect of a single room. Although all the small rooms were single rooms, the use of the phrase single room served to make a threat more terrifying. During my stay in Ward 4 I slept first in the observation dormitory and later in the dormitory, down the other end, where the beds had floral bedspreads and where, because of the lack of space, there was an overflow of beds into the corridor. I liked the observation dormitory at night with the night nurse sitting in the armchair brought in from the mess room, knitting an endless number of cardigans and poring over pull-out pattern supplements in the women's magazines, and snatching a quick nap with her feet up on the fire guard and the fire pleasantly warming her bottom. I liked the ritual of going to bed, with the faithful Mrs. Pilling sending in a tray of hot milk drinks, and one of the patients marching in balancing like a waitress a high pile of dun-colored chambers. I liked the bed side by side and the reassurance of other people's soft breathing mingled with the irritation of their snoring and their secret conversations and the tinkle-tinkle and warm smell like a cow byre when they used their chambers in the night. I dreaded that one day Matron Glass, hearing that I had been difficult or uncooperative, would address me sharply, right? Single room for you, my lady. Hearing other people threatened so often made me more afraid, and seeing that a patient, in the act of being taken to a single room, always struggled and screamed, made me morbidly curious about what the room contained that, overnight, it could change people who screamed and disobeyed into people who sat, withdrawn, and obeyed listlessly when ordered day room, dining room, bed. Yet not all people changed, and those who did not respond to the foursquare shuttered influence of the room, who could not be taught what Matron Glass or Sister Honey decreed to be a lesson, were removed to Ward 2. And Ward 2 was my fear. They sent you there if you were uncooperative, or if persistent doses of ECT did not produce in you an improvement which was judged largely by your submission and prompt obedience to orders. Dayroom ladies, rise ladies, bed ladies. You learned with earnest dedication to fit in, you learned not to cry in company but to smile and pronounce yourself pleased, and to ask from time to time if you could go home, as proof that you were getting better and therefore in no need of being smuggled in the night to Ward 2. You learned the chores, to make your bed with the government motto facing the correct way and the corners of the counterpane neatly angled, to rub up the dormitory and the corridor, working the heavy bumper on the piece of torn blanket smeared with skittery yellow polish that distributed its energetic soaking smell from the first day it was fetched with the weekly stores in the basket beside the tins of jam, jars of vinegar and the huge blocks of cheese and butter which Mrs. Pilling and Mrs. Everett quarried with a knife specially unlocked from the knife box. You learned the routine, that it was so, that bath night was Wednesday, but that those who could be trusted to wash further than their wrists were allowed to bathe any night in the large bathroom where the roof soared like in a railway station and 3 deep tubs lay side by side, each with its locked box containing the taps. In small print so that one might mistake it for a railway timetable, the list of bathing rules was pasted on the wall. It was an old list, issued at the beginning of the century, and contained 14 rules which stated, for example, that no patient might take a bath unless an attendant were present, that 6 inches only of water should be run into the bath, the cold water first, that no brush of any kind should be employed in bathing a patient. So we bathed, one in each bath, without screens, gazing curiously at one another's bodies, at the pendulous bellies and tired breasts, the sated wisps of body hair, the unwieldy and the supple shapes that formed to women the nagging and perpetual roughness of their flesh. Settling in, the doctor would inquire from time to time, as a passing breeze from another country might address an animal which it happened to catch sight of preparing for hibernation. The act of settling in was surrounded with approval. The sooner you settle, the sooner you'll be allowed home, was the ruling logic. And if you can't adapt yourself to living in a mental hospital, how do you expect to be able to live out in the world? How indeed. In the early days I looked with pity and curiosity and wonder upon the few patients in the observation ward who would be there forever, Mrs. Pilling, Mrs. Everett, who, as an inexperienced overwrought young mother, had murdered her little girl, Miss Dennis, slight, sharp-tongued, with neatly rolled grey hair, whose days were devoted to doing out the charge room at the nurse's home, polishing the silver and the water glasses and the fruit dishes of the illustrious white-veiled sisters, and the few other permanent patients who comprised those who knew the rules and could explain them, how when you were well enough you were given limited parole, and when you were very well and trusted, as most of these patients were, you were given full parole and allowed to wander where you wished in the hospital grounds, how on leaving the hospital you were not immediately discharged but placed on probation, as if you had committed a criminal offense, so that you might be away from the hospital. And still be legally insane, unable to vote, to sign papers or travel abroad. In those days there was no voluntary admission. We were all insane under the Mental Defectives Act, 1928. These long-term patients who were more like employees of the hospital could discuss the hierarchy of the staff, the private life of the matron who lived in a flat in the front of the building. Minnie, from Ward 1, was the matron's personal maid and was allowed a key and used to come through the ward during the day with the papers and the latest gossip from down the front, which she passed on to Mrs. Everett and Mrs. Pilling and, particularly, Miss Dennis, who liked to reinforce her superiority of manner with the superiority of being well-informed. We learn of the life of the doctors from Carrie, from Ward 1, who worked at the doctor's flat, and from Molly, who worked over the road for another doctor and his family. His wife nags, she said, triumphantly, for it seemed to strengthen his bonds with patients who, it seemed, were ready to understand him. So we, the newcomers, learned of important events like Christmas. They put all the tables together for Christmas dinner. We have pork and apple sauce, everybody gets a present. Church-going, dances, as part of the new attitude to mental patients, dances were now being held, the hospital sports, the opening of the bowling green, the cricket match between the hospital and the village, the visit of the one lolly man from the Patients' and Prisoners' Aid Society. The other permanent patients lived in Ward 2. Except at ECT we saw little of these people. We heard them as background noises from their special park and yard, and at night when their sleeping quarters, known as the brick building, became like a hive with the bees wailing and screaming behind the rusted wire netting windows, as if their day's honey had been lost or never gathered. Sometimes we saw them in the evening being rushed into the brick building and seeming to execute a wild dance before they entered, as if to signal the direction of the flowerless fields where for one more day in the numerous years of their search they had wasted their time and yearning. And occasionally we glimpsed these same people in their dark blue striped smocks, their skin sun-stained and wrinkled, being driven, flanked by nurses, from the day room of their ward to the park where they would spend the rest of the day. And then they looked, sad to say, like people. We could not deny their relationship to us, but they moved their heads, bowed, their bodies half crouching, as if they faced a driving blizzard, as if they pushed on to a kind of one-ton camp of the soul, with no hope of getting there. Or sometimes when church was held by the chaplain in the hospital hall and we attended out of boredom or out of a desire like Lear and Cordelia in prison to pray and sing, a restless group from Ward 2 would be led in and persuaded to sit on the long wooden seats. They sang with a gusto which seemed to disturb the minister standing soberly and self-consciously before his lectern, his Bible lying open at the lesson of comfort which he read rather guiltily and sentimentally. The Ward 2 people in their curious assortment of ward hats behaved like excited children bobbing up and down and interrupting the sermon with well-placed remarks. They smiled placidly when prayers were offered for those sick in mind. They sang fervently, "Shall we gather at the river? The beautiful, beautiful river. Shall we gather at the river that flows by the throne of God? And summer suns are glowing over land and sea. Happy light is flowing, bountiful and free." The men sat on one side of the hall, the women on the other. Beneath the surface activities of church, notes were passed, escapes plotted, endearments exchanged. The men's voices, prolonged and powerful if sometimes out of tune, often showed unwillingness to abandon a satisfying last note, keeping the sympathetic organist, a woman from Ward 1 who was the image of George III, playing on with soporific everlastingness until the chaplain, whose appreciation of eternity was dependent on its elusiveness and who felt reluctant to accept its materialization as the amen of "Shall we gather at the river" or "Jesus shall reign where'er the sun," would determinately interrupt, raising his voice to pronounce the blessing, "And now may the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ abide with us each one now and forevermore." The Ward 2 people liked to stay behind to shake hands with the chaplain and talk to him of domestic affairs, but we, the Ward 4 people, feeling alarmed at their friendliness as if perhaps it were a symptom of the infection of permanence that might too easily spread to us, hurried from the hall and across our daisy-covered park to our own ward. Not one of the strenuously applied platitudes could fit the people of Ward 2. They're happy in their own way. They're so far gone they don't really suffer. They're used to it, they don't realize anymore. Nothing makes any difference to them. They haunted me, not the few articulate ones who had been to church, but those I glimpsed sometimes through the fence into the park or the yard. Who were they? Why were they in hospital? Why were they so changed from people that you see walking and talking in the streets of the world? And what was the meaning of the gifts or rejects which they threw over the park and yard fence? Pieces of cloth, crusts, feces, shoes, in a barrage of love and hate for what lay beyond? Sunday dinner, roast mutton, was carved, like the other dinners of the week, by Matron Glass, who went from ward to ward for the purpose, picking on her way a few tidbits to test the cooking. The meat was forked onto the plates by Sister Honey standing behind the long serving table. The vegetables were dolled on by the next in command, while Mrs. Everett, flushed and anxious in case, having been too generous with the first few helpings, she had to go canny with the remainder, poured on the weed green mint sauce. Now the serving was ready and we moved from the queue to take our place at the table and await the final serving and the saying of grace by Sister Honey. "For what you are about to receive the Lord make you truly thankful." Only then could we set about eating the now lukewarm roast and greens and potatoes lying in their stiff overcoats of fat. There was no obligation to eat, although we were frequently warned that others are worse off on the other side of the world, with the convenient propensity that people show for making hunger grief any discomfort antipodean. Sometimes with unexpected charity which earned our gratitude and made us realize that she was human after all, Sister Honey let us eat first, and said grace after the meal when the knives had been collected, counted and locked in their box and we were sitting waiting for the mail and announcements which were usually warnings of misdoings, and began, "Now in future I don't want," or some of the patients had been reported as, to which we listened with fearful attention. Yet Sister Honey did not rule entirely by fear. She had spurts of gaiety which found their expression in what she called get-togethers around the ward piano of an evening, when she would take off her red cardigan, in a liberal gesture, and hang it on the back of a chair, and sit down at the piano and play for us the songs usually of another generation, demanding in her sharp voice, "Come on, sing up everyone. When there's a rainbow on the river. You get the feeling. Romance is stealing right out of the blue into your heart. And when Irish eyes are smiling and row to the aisles, ending with a hymn. There is a green hill far away, without a city wall, where the dear Lord was crucified, who died to save us all." At this point Sister's expression would become severe and she would turn to look meaningfully at us as if to say, "Remember, you've got something to be grateful for, so pull yourselves together, snap out of it, everything is being done for your own good, there are others far worse off than you, my ladies." Then with a slightly bitter smile around her thin, unpainted lips she would play a dance tune and tell us to get up and dance with one another to finish the evening. When she left the day room after this display of straight-backed comradeship, people remarked, "She's a sport anyway." And the next morning she would look at us grimly and coldly as she made the announcement, "No breakfast for you. You're for treatment." Sunday was a pleasant day compared with the rest of the week. No shock treatment, church in the morning, in the afternoon a walk in the grounds, perhaps up past the poplars, away up the hill past the wooden building where some of the men lived, the old doddering ones who could only sit out in the sun, and the younger Mongols and imbeciles who gave a simple hop around the farm and in the garden. A rope clothesline sagging with their striped ward clothes was stretched between two poles at the back door. Sometimes we saw a face peering at us from the curtainless windows, or a little group sitting in the sun staring, their lips moving in the way old people have, as if in their life they have never been able to say what they needed to say or have never had anyone to say it to, and now when they are old they babble on and on, not minding the words, only to get it said in time. While you are alive and persist in the sovereign act of living, you are surrounded by invisible courtiers of being which keep yourself spruce and well fed, as the bees attend their queen, but when you are near death these courtiers neglect you or even join forces to kill you, and you acquire the inner, unkempt look of the dying. The unkemptness of these old men showed from within, beyond the shabby appearance of their braces hitching their pants anyhow, their unbuttoned flies, their flannel shirts bunched out, hanging loose. When we passed their dining room and looked in at the bare wooden tables already laid for tea with the thick cup, plate and spoon at each place, I was depressed by the dreariness of a day where tea is prepared for immediately after dinner. After tea, no doubt, the old men were put to bed at once, in the daylight. I wanted to go in the dining room and put a white cloth and flowers on the long tables. The authorities in some of the hospital wards of the world had learned, it had been reported in the newspapers, with headlines, that flowers helped. Could they have helped in this men's ward? Perhaps not. It seemed to be a place where there was no one home. I was reminded of the times when my father used to come home from work and my mother was perhaps in the garden or the lavatory or talking to one of the neighbors over the fence, and a look of panic would cross my father's face as he walked into the empty kitchen. "Where's Mom?" he would say. And I was reminded of a poem we used to say at school, a mysterious poem beginning, "Is there anyone there?" said the traveler, knocking on the moonlit door. A traveler could knock for years at the door of that dismal ward. He could even shout, like the traveler in the poem, "Tell them I came," and he could get no answer. The old men were dead though their mouths moved and they snaffled their tea and borstal cake, though they sat in the gentle sun with their long sharp afternoon shadows, their only companions, lying motionless and dumb beside them. On our walk we also visited the calf paddock where the knock-kneed Frisians thrust their heads through the fence to us, sucking with their raspy tongues on our extended hands. Or we walked, holding our noses, through the pigsties watching the piglets like pink sausages side by side feeding from their supine frozy mothers, or the half-grown pigs nuzzling the ward leftovers and snorting in the trough swillied with skim milk. Did the pigs realize that on our ward dining room wall they had a notice all to themselves? "Please do not put fish bones in the pig tin." Valuable pigs have been lost through this practice. Up near the sties we would stand on the hill and look out and down at the sea, at the smoke on the horizon of a ship carrying wheat or coal to one of the East Coast ports. Nearer, below us were the grey slated roofs of the hospital's main building with its small barred windows built to resist the arrows of light, and the tower with its bell like an ancient prison bell which still tolled heavily morning and evening. Or we walked down towards the front garden past the sacred enclosure marked "Trespassing Forbidden," where the superintendent lived. We would dawdle on, our pace being set by the slowest walker, until we halted at the cattle stock by the front gate beyond which lay the world, the tiny grassy village of Cliffhaven with its school and church and two general stores, and, down the road past the doctor's house, its railway station and the red wooden enclosure, like a school playroom that was the waiting room, where the seagulls flew inside leaving black and grey mottled splashes on the floor, where abandoned luggage was piled in. The corner as if it had lain there for many years, where the broken hinged door led to the lavatory with the rusty jerk marks down its bowl and in the wash basin, the pool of water on the floor, and the scrap of toilet paper half covering the darkened mound of somebody's business not flushed away. We stood at the gate, considering the marvel of the world where people, such as the deception of memory, did as they pleased, owned furniture, dressing tables with doilies on them and wardrobes with mirrors, and doors they could open and shut and open as many times as they chose, and no name tape sewn inside the neck of their clothes, and handbags to carry, with nail files and makeup, and no one to watch while they were eating and to collect and count the knives afterwards and say in a frightening voice, "Rise, ladies." We retraced our steps then up the gravel path toward 4. The door would be unlocked for us and we would be led down the corridor past the TB rooms and the old ladies' rooms and Mrs. Pilling's room, to the coat cupboard to remove our coats and scarves and, except for the guileful few, sometimes including myself, who could persuade the nurse that they always helped to set the tables for tea or who never missed, attending to the eggs for the observation dormitory while they boiled on the dining room fire or usually wheeled the tea trolley alone to the dormitory, we were locked in the day room until tea time. There the others too old or too ill who had not been out walking looked up dully as we entered with our cheeks pink, excited with what we had seen, the pigs, the calves, the doctors washing on the line, the magnolia tree, the pride of the hospital, in bloom. And we had been to the gate, to the cattle stop at the gate. The people stared, they were not impressed. They continued staring, some moaning softly, others going through the worn routine of rattling at the day room door, of calling for help, others gazing from the wide windows at the trees, the copper beech trees shining in the afternoon sun and the fir trees and the blackbirds in their low flight across the grass. What did it matter that we had been to the gate, to the cattle stop, to the gate? The people in the day room seemed to look at us accusingly as if we had wasted our time by wandering in the grounds. They had no need to go for walks, they knew without seeing it the magnolia in bloom. We sat down, subdued, and waited for tea time. Tomorrow was Monday. Keep on your nightgown and dressing gown, your nightgown and dressing gown and nightgown. After 3 years of living in Ward 4 and going dutifully for treatment on nearly every morning when it was required of me, and earning Mrs. Pilling's respect by my enthusiastic polishing of the corridor and Mrs. Everett's goodwill by my, sometimes feigned, willingness to peel apples and polish the silver on a Friday, and the increasing disapproval of Matron Glass and Sister Honey by my tendency to panic at mealtimes, I was pronounced well enough to go home. Once people knew you were going home, they looked upon you with envy and seemed compelled to point you out amongst themselves and to their visitors, saying, "There's Mona, or Dolly, or Nancy. She's going home." Really, the visitors would remark, like tourists in a foreign land when a building they regard as commonplace is pointed out to them as a marvel. It was as well not to talk about it if you were going home, not even to say you were going. You felt the guilt of it and the pleasure. You felt like a child at an orphanage who has been accepted for adoption and must face, when your new parents call for you, the longing gaze of the deprived people around you. My mother was to call for me. Like the rest of the family, she had been shocked and frightened at the thought that one of her daughters had landed up in Cliffhaven. The family notion of people in Cliffhaven, in any mental hospital, was gathered from jokes about loonies, about visiting dignitaries on tours of inspection being asked their name by one of the loonies and when they answered Lord or Sir, meeting with the reply, "You'll soon get over that." I thought I was the King of England when I came here. My family had not visited me often. They seemed to me strange and remote, and sometimes when I glanced quickly at my mother and father I surprised their bodies falling apart and crumbling, and the cells of their skin like grains of wheat being crushed to a fine powder. Sometimes they played tricks on me and vanished and changed to birds beating powerful wings and setting up a storm in the air. My mother wore new clothes which I did not trust. For years, ever since she had been married, her main article of clothing had been what she called a nice navy blue costume. But lately she had sent her outsize measurements to a mail-order firm in the north and it had delivered to her a brown costume with fine brown stripes. She had never worn brown before, not a brown costume, and seemed ill at ease, as if harboring something dishonest, when she came to visit me in her new clothes. Boot polished brown, with a secret shine and easily stained with grass when we sat down to have our picnic under the copper beech tree. So my mother came to take me home. She talked in a high excited voice to the doctor, assuring him indignantly that of course I have never heard voices or seen things and that there was nothing the matter with me. My mother was suspicious of the doctor. In some ways she regarded my illness as a reflection on herself, as something to be ashamed of, to be hushed up, to be denied if necessary. She was deeply indignant but complied with the doctor's suggestion that I should not live at home, that I should go up north and live for a time with my sister who had expressed a willingness to have me. I said goodbye to Mrs. Everett and Mrs. Pilling and the baker and the pig boy and the nurses, the timid new ones filling the coal buckets, cleaning the fireplaces and trying to carry out trays of hot ashes through the draft from the side door, working so hard in their 12 hours a day, looking so flushed and disheveled and tired, with stains of soot on the front of their new pink uniform and red marks around their heels where the stiff duty shoes were rubbing. But they were learning. They were learning to give orders that would be obeyed promptly, and to push into line the wandering herd. "Goodbye," I said, promising to write, and knowing that after the first few letters there would be nothing to say except the kind of phrases which people use like mothballs to try and preserve a period of time. "Does Dr. Howell still come to the evenings on Mondays? I suppose Pavlova is still the same as ever? Do you still have mince and wallboard pastry on Tuesdays?" There remained an interview with the superintendent who had never spoken to me but whom I had sometimes seen making his Friday rounds, driving from ward to ward along the narrow tree-lined roads in his powerful amply-buttocked maroon car with his red setter Molly gazing from the window. Dr. Portman was a plump short dark Englishman with an indulged mustache, and brown eyes glittering beneath creepered brows. He was a man of decisive attitudes and gestures with quick sympathies and a sense of the sublime which exceeded his mental strutting, as if a rooster with purpose and success had taken to wearing buskins. Dr. Portman was nicknamed the Mad Major. I knocked and entered his room and stood timidly on the red carpet. On his desk stood a framed motto, in Italian, which read "Precious is the passing moment." "Come and sit down," he said kindly. I sat down. He leaned forward. "Have you ever been raped?" he asked. I told him no. He got up from his desk then and came and shook hands with me and wished me well, and I left the hospital. I was on probation. So I went up north to a land of palm trees and mangroves like malignant growths in the mud-filled throats of the bays, and orange trees with their leaves accepting darkly and seriously, in their own house as it were, the unwarranted globular outbursts of winter flame, and the sky faultless and remote. This was up north. I stayed for a few weeks with my sister. Have you ever been a spinster living in a small house with your sister and her husband and their new first child? Watching them rub noses and pinch and tickle, and in the night, when you lie on the coffin narrow camp bed that would not hold two people anyway, listening to them because you cannot help it? I did not know my own identity. I was burgled of body and hung in the sky like a woman of straw. The day seemed palpable about me yet receded when I moved to touch it, for fear that I might contaminate it. I nagged at the sky. It grew a protective porcelain filling of cloud. I was not a mosquito nor a cricket nor a bamboo tree, therefore I found myself, when it was full summer, lying in a gaily quilted bed in a spotless room called an observation dormitory in Ward 7 of Treecroft Mental Hospital, up north. The room overlooked a garden of blown roses and orange-scented arum lilies that grow wild, surrounding a sun-dried lawn with a weeping willow tree in the center. Although there was no creek or river, the weeping willow tree surely grew there, no doubt with the faithful reckoning that keeps some people and trees alive, waiting for the secret provision. Around the garden stood a high wall disguised and made more seemly by its dress of slow-burning ivy. I noticed that the windows of the dormitory opened casement style so that one would not have guessed they were fixed to open a limited distance. I could not see upon them the crudely nailed boards which were a feature of Cliffhaven windows. The dormitory felt cool and shaded. I could see, outside, people in sunfrocks walking to and fro or sitting down in the shade of the weeping willow. The air was peaceful. There were no screams, protests, moanings, no sound of scuffles as a patient was forcibly persuaded to obey orders. For the people were patients. And it was a hospital. Wasn't it? I thought, yes, certainly it is a hospital. I had heard them say Treecroft Mental Hospital where the murderers go, this way driver. In the bed opposite me was a woman sitting up talking to anyone who might be listening. "I am Mrs. Ogden," she said. Her dresses had been marked, her shoes, her nighties, and in the rush of admission they had forgotten to mark her, therefore she was telling people her name, indelibly, like the ink on the tape. "I am Mrs. Ogden." Her face had the damply absorbent pallor, her mouth the moistness with the corners drawn in, that I had seen on the consumptives at Cliffhaven. She talked breathlessly, incessantly, full of the excitement of her operation in the city where she had had a number of ribs removed. She displayed the scars. She recounted the occasion. She explained esoteric phrases of life in a general hospital. "I was on hours," she said blissfully. "Do you know what that means? It means you are allowed up each day for so many hours." We sat around in ward chairs, in our dressing gowns. There was thunder and lightning twice and rain for a week in the west sun. On the terrace. It's way out of town, really. People call me Betty. Although I could not communicate with her because I was speechless, I lay in my bed, staring at her, and trying to warn her of the veneer of peace and pleasantness, the brightness of the bedspreads and the sun-frocked people outside. I tried to say, beware, the room is laid with traps and hung with hooks. For there was growing in my mind a dread which was not diminished but increased by the sight of the garden, the weeping willow, the apparently contented patients roving freely across the sun-baked lawn. I marveled that Mrs. Ogden seemed so untroubled. How could she not know about the danger? Why did she not beware, surround herself with all possible safety measures, move lower down in her bed and draw the bedclothes up for protection? I lay and watched the dark dread growing like one of those fairy tale plants whose existence depends upon their lack of discipline, their uncontrolled urge to grow through and across and into and beyond until they reach the sky and block the sun. My fear crept beyond myself and into the tranquil dormitory, and turned upon me, like a child upon its parent, threatening me. I watched the ward sister, Sister Creed, going her rounds with the doctor, speaking softly and calmly and smiling at Mrs. Ogden and myself, the only ones in bed, as a genteel hostess might welcome her guests for the weekend. But as they passed nearer and walked in full view through the open door into the garden, I noticed, with a feeling of alarm, that both the doctor and Sister Creed were limping. Surely it was more than coincidence. I was filled with the superstitious fear that besets primitive people and children and makes them invoke gods and repeat rhymes when faced with deformities. I was reminded of a woman we used to call the late lady. We used to meet her on the way to school if we were in danger of being late. The late lady, we would whisper with horror in our voices and with our hearts beating fast, and with the stitch in our sides we would run for dear life to get out of sight of the limping lady and to get to school in time for the march-in. Further, the sight of the Treecroft matron convinced me that my fears were not groundless, and at first I thought that Matron Glass had followed me up from the south and adopted the identity of Matron Burrow. Even their bodies were the same, huge, encased in the white uniform through which you could see the marks, like bars, of their corset. Matron Burrow's voice was deep and admonishing, and when she looked at Mrs. Ogden and myself her expression told us that our lying in bed, putting into disarray the stiff sheets spotless from the hospital laundry, and interfering with the peaceful effect created by the rows of spruce unoccupied beds, their quilts flipped exactly, their casters turned at the right angle, was an affront to Ward 7, and the sooner we were up out of that, the better. I dreaded the moment when I should have to get dressed and stand upright buffeted by the waves in the mid-ocean of the room, and test the reality of the peace and contentment that I had observed from my bed. I could not explain my fear. What if Ward 7 were but a subaqueous condition of the mind which gave the fearful shades drowned their rhythmic distortion of peace, and what if, upon my getting up from my bed, the perspective was suddenly altered, or I was led into a track where a fire burning in the walls had dried up the water and destroyed the peace by exposing in harsh daylight the submerged shades in all their terror? How could I know? The rule was to stay in bed for 2 days. I was grateful. I lay and let the doctor examine me, with the dormitory nurse modestly arranging the blankets. I made a fist, followed Dr. Toll's finger, pressed his hands away, felt the pin prick, breathed, said 99, had my knee tapped and the sole of my foot scraped. I did not ask the doctor to explain Sister Creed's limp or the startling resemblance between Matron Burrow and Matron Glass of Cliffhaven, or to tell me the meaning of the weeping willow tree, the message of the mosquitoes, the bamboo, the telephoning crickets, mason flies, hoover bugs, ants that stopped in their tracks and wept if they lost their way, the great cliff-like rents in the earth, the aluminium rain boiling upon the earth. Dr. Toll was a late afternoon shadow, neat, in a white coat, with gold planted between his 2 front teeth, a flashy loop to which his tongue kept returning as if to make sure of its safety, or perhaps to work it loose and get rid of it like an overexposed bad habit that has lost its original delight and value. Do you know where you are? I was tempted at first to question that I was lying in Ward 7 of Treecroft Mental Hospital. Treecroft. It made me think that perhaps I had been admitted to a dovecot. But I was speechless and only stared at Dr. Toll's gold tooth. We'll give her ECT tomorrow, he told Sister Creed. I could not absorb any more fearful possibilities. I was so tired. If it rained, the harp hanging on the willow tree would get wet, and still I did not care. Mrs. Ogden was coughing, reaching for her sputum box and carefully measuring what she spat into it. She was flushed as if she had been making love to something or somebody that no one else could see, and she drew her breath excitedly when she saw the nurse approaching with chart and thermometer. "It's up," she said triumphantly, as if she had won an argument with the invisible presence that seemed to attend her. The next morning I was led with other patients in my nightgown and dressing gown into the garden and across to another ward which also opened upon the garden. I was put to bed in a room in a corridor of single rooms and told to lie there quietly and wait. I lay, tracing the pattern of the red mat on the floor, and thinking that at Cliffhaven I had never seen mats on the floors of rooms, and drowsily wondering what was going to happen to me, as if I were a threatened character in an episode of a not very gripping serial. Suddenly I heard the familiar calamitous despairing cry of a patient undergoing ECT, and snorting noises in the room next door, and the sound of something being wheeled along the corridor to my room. The door opened. A strange doctor stood there with an ECT machine on a trolley. He gave me a quick evil glance, approached my bed, thrust the headphones over my temples, and suddenly I was unconscious, contending alone with nightmares of grief and despair. When I woke I was led back through the garden, past the weeping willow and the empty bird bath where a few sparrows flicked themselves with dust, to peaceful Ward 7, so peaceful that I might have wondered if the screams and the creeping machine really existed, had I not retained in my memory, as if it had entered almost without my permission, the peculiar smell of the other ward, a kind of ward body odor of polish and urine blended, in the manner of tobacco or herbs, to a compression of desolation, and exuded now strongly now faintly as it was whittled, deliberately or casually, by the hanging around corner-leaning presence that one may call time. In a few days I was up and dressed, wandering around the ward and sitting in the garden under the willow tree and learning, as I tried to forget my still growing disquiet and dread and the haunting smell of the other ward, as I became to all appearances one of the gentle contented patients of Ward 7, that the ECT which happened 3 times a week, and the succession of screams heard as the machine advanced along the corridor, were a nightmare that one suffered for one's own good. For your own good is a persuasive argument that will eventually make man agree to his own destruction. I tried to reassure myself by remembering that in Ward 7 that the new attitude, mental patients are people like you and me, seemed to predominate, the bright counterpanes, pastel-shaded walls supposed to soothe, a few abstract paintings hanging paint-in-cheek in the sitting room, tables for 4 in the dining room, gay with checked cloths, everything to keep up the pretense that Treecroft was a hotel, not a mental hospital, and anyway the words mental hospital were now frowned upon, the proper designation was now psychiatric unit. The kindly Sister Creed dined with us. We had cream on our pudding, bacon and eggs for breakfast, all cooked in the ward kitchen by Hilsey, Mrs. Hill, another of the faithful long-term patients whose life is to serve. She worked from morning till late at night, though her face was always pale, her eyes cavernous and dark, and her ankles swelled at night. "Look at my ankles," she would say. Someone would remark, "Hilsey, you shouldn't work so hard." "No, perhaps I shouldn't," was the answer. But the next morning she would be up early and in the kitchen preparing breakfast, looking after the nurses with surprise cups of tea. "Hilsey, you're an angel," scrubbing, polishing. On Sundays, her only day off, when she stayed in bed all day, people would ask, with a trace of panic and irritation, "Where's Hilsey?" And on that day nothing seemed to go right. Food was burnt and shriveled, utensils were lost, nobody knew where to look or how to set about doing things, and Hilsey was being continually interrupted in her rest by people going to her room and demanding to know where and why and how. Hilsey's room, like Mrs. Pilling's, was decorated with pictures and calendars. She had roses from the garden in a bowl on her dressing table and a photograph of her son in his sailor's uniform, a pale handsome lad like his mother. She had been taken to Treecroft when he was born, and in those days there had been no treatment for her. On visiting days almost everyone had a visitor. An aunt decided to adopt me and visit me each week, making a long journey by tram from the outskirts of the city. She was a middle-aged woman who had unconsciously or deliberately followed the current fashion advice that pink and gray are right colors for middle-aged people. She wore pink blouses and gray suits and floating chiffon scarves. Her complexion was a tinted map of red patches and vein tributaries. Her eyes were vague, the whites curdled with pink like blood-specked white of egg. She was all kindness, with an intuitive knowledge of how to be a good hospital visitor, to bring comforting things to eat, and after the first rather embarrassed, "How are you?" which did not demand a detailed reply, sit dreamily in the garden, quiet, composed, uninquisitive, offering at intervals peppermint creams and fancy cakes. She expressed delight at the hospital, at the kindness of the staff, the cheerfulness of the ward, and the fact that the patients seemed to have nothing wrong with them. One could hear other visitors making similar remarks. "You're lucky to be here, with everybody so good. It looks to me like an expensive hotel. I think I'll have a nervous breakdown myself sometime. I'm only joking, of course. I know what you've been through." Most of the patients in Ward 7 like to talk with their visitors about their nervous breakdown, the plan of it, and details of it, as if it were a piece of property they had unexpectedly acquired. They liked to tell those nearest to them what they had been through. And their visitors comforted them by saying, truthfully, "You'll be home soon, another few weeks and you'll be home." And many patients did go home. There were farewells and thank yous, addresses exchanged, and promises to write, and promises to spread the news that mental hospitals were certainly not what people seemed to think, that the letters full of shocking details that appeared in the newspapers were the work of cranks and liars. For had not the patients of Ward 7 seen for themselves the modern conditions? That patients were regarded as human beings and cared for with kindness? Certainly shock treatment was unpleasant, but after all it was for people's own good, wasn't it? Besides, it was held in another ward, and you were so dopey going and coming that you didn't remember much anyway. The point was that you were better and going home, and you wouldn't be afraid if at any other time you had to return to Treecroft Hospital. And one day Dr. Toll said to me, "Ju, we'll soon have you fit in well." We saw little of him. He was always busy and only rarely found time to say, "What are you knitting?" "You're doing nicely." "Hot today, isn't it?" and other stagnant phrases. He cared for, or tried to care for, at least 1,000 women. I didn't feel ill, but I was afraid. Dr. Toll limped. Sister Creed limped. Matron Burroughs' butcher-like face swelled before me in a threatening manner. Yet I went obediently to the other ward, known as Ward 45N1, for ECT, and tried to suppress the disquiet which amounted to panic at the distinctive ward smell, and at the very name of the ward, 45N1, a sinister code no doubt, and at the sight of the ward's TB wing, which opened off the kitchen and had a shack-like appearance with its bare wooden floors and corrugated iron roof, which must have given the rooms an unbearable intensity of heat from the day-long sun. Thudding like a headache in the sky. The bare floors, contrasting with the dignity and brightness of Ward 7, depressed me, and I tried to forget them, and I felt the necessity of not believing in their existence. In my mind I dare not contain an image of both Ward 7 and the 45N1 TB wing. I returned with almost hysterical pleasure from the smell of desolation and the sight of the stark makeshift ward, to the supposed reality of Ward 7 and Betty Ogden's confident chatter and the fretful languor of the women gently describing their homes, their families, their symptoms, and the pleasant conditions they found in hospital. But I felt increasingly like a guest who is given every hospitality in a country mansion, yet who finds in unexpected moments a trace of a mysterious presence, sliding panels, secret tappings, and at last surprises the host and hostess in clandestine conversations and plottings with mention of poison, torture, death. Or was I inhabiting, as it were, as guest for the weekend, my own mind, and becoming more and more perturbed by its manifestation of evil? But suddenly one evening there was a quarrel in the bathroom between Elizabeth and Mrs. Dean. "I'm having first bath." "No. I'm having first bath." A mere quarrel about a bath, you will say. What is important in that, or unusual or terrifying? Few people quarreled in Ward 7. A patient who became uncooperative in this respect was speedily transferred to what was called vaguely another ward. Perhaps the argument might have died or been solved peaceably had not Matron Burrow on her evening round, overheard, and opening the door of the bathroom inquired in a shocked voice, "What on earth is going on?" and stood with her fierce gaze on the half-dressed Mrs. Dean, a middle-aged woman suffering from the fact of middle age, her mind out of step with her body, nervous, worried about her appearance and her accumulation of fat, and trying to tear down the signpost held before her by her age. Matron Burrow's glance sent her into a fury. She began to call Matron names, to swear at her. "You big fat bloody bullock, don't you stare at me." Matron's face and neck reddened. She too was sensitive about her appearance. "Out of here," she said. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Pull yourself together. There's no excuse for your behavior." Mrs. Dean refused to leave the bathroom. Elizabeth was standing by, subdued, a picture of cooperation. "Right," snapped matron, beckoning to a nurse, and moving towards the door in the bathroom which was always kept locked and which I had never seen used. Matron Burrow opened it, and with the 3 other nurses who had arrived, dragged the struggling Mrs. Dean through the door. She never returned to the ward. I brooded upon this mysterious disappearance. Where had she gone? To another ward? Then one day, in recognition of the fact that I was getting well and would soon be allowed out, a nurse asked me to accompany her to the big kitchen to return the porridge can. The porridge was the only food not cooked by Hilsey. I had never seen beyond the ward's 7 garden, and I gazed about me, asking questions, and expressing surprise that the hospital was such an extensive place. Seen from the outside, from beyond the genteel front entrance where it looked like an ivy-covered mansion, it was a number of sprawling dilapidated buildings. The big kitchen, squat and dirty in appearance, stood opposite a ward that seemed in such a state of decay that I asked its name. "What's that place?" "Oh, that? Lone Lodge." We entered the poorly lit, poorly ventilated kitchen, and were immediately surrounded by the smell of boiled cabbage. We passed a vat which bubbled with greasy meat, and another where a thick mess of farina was cooking, watched over by a hairy-chested man in an open-necked check shirt. He suddenly thrust his hairy arm into the vat of farina and began stirring vigorously. I was amazed, and impressed, and eager to get back to reassure myself that our ward meals were cooked by Hilsey. Indeed, that Ward 7 was still in existence. Returning past the conglomeration of old buildings which seemed unreal in their lack of relationship to our bright admission ward, we met 2 attendants carrying out the back way from 45N1, a corpse, bloated looking under its canvas. "That's Mrs. Dean," the nurse said indiscreetly. "She died." I was glad to return to Ward 7 and try to convince myself that the garden, the lawn, the weeping willow, the windows and doors wide open, were not a dream, and that Tricroft, even if some of its buildings appeared antiquated, was a hospital with a modern attitude to mental illness. But I was attacked increasingly by disquiet. I had seen, as it were, the sliding panels, overheard the sinister conversation. I continued to have ECT, dreading more and more the sound of the trolley and the stifled screams as it moved from room to room, nearer and nearer. And suddenly the brightness of Ward 7 seemed to burst into a glare of chaotic vegetation, as if it existed now merely to camouflage the movements of deadly reptiles and poisonous insects. I heard the nurses speaking sharply, threateningly. At mealtimes now the checked tablecloth startled me. They seemed striped with blood and disaster. No one suspected the growing danger. I noticed other doors besides the mysterious one in the bathroom, and I had no means of finding where they led, although once there was a door opened into another ward and the sour smell of wet bedclothes seeped through and mingled with the heavy sweetness of the arum lilies on the mantelpiece, the Christmas lilies that relatives use at funerals to hide the smell of death. It was late summer now, with explosions of thunder that almost cracked our bones and vivid graphs of lightning scrawled in the sky. The bird bath in the garden overflowed with warm steamy rain. The soaked slender leaves of the weeping willow drooped, burned at the edges and the tips, like soft green curls of paper held to a flame and drawn swiftly away. And we sat inside in the supposedly friendly room. Slowly, twitching a muscle, refocusing a malevolent gaze, the insects moved across the carpet and the reptiles slid through the pastel-shaded slime of the walls, their tongues darting and devouring. And now, when Aunt Rose came to visit me, I was yet more silent, and helped myself more feverishly to peppermint creams and fancy cakes. Our wooden seat under the willow tree was battered and blood-stained. People were digging graves on the lawn in the night. Tiny lizards with brown corrugated faces came from the door of 45N1 and snapped up the sun and disappeared, their throats knocking. "It's so peaceful here," said Aunt Rose. It began to snow. "Soon," the doctor repeated, "we'll have you fit and well." He also did not seem to be aware of the mysterious processions of the lights. The crepe and calico circles, the white reed, the sprocket conforming, the thrown mutinous, and the moss-grown faces, and the fingerprints are the fingerprints of swift click and light, the secret camera. I grew more frightened. I began to wander in the night and to panic at mealtimes, faced with the squares of blood and the bone china. Why was it bone? I tried to understand what was happening. When the door to the other ward was sometimes opened, I tried to realize the juxtaposition of Ward 7 and Ward 6 where, crowded bed to bed, the old women lay with dropped jaws and hollow cheeks and hands fighting at the bedclothes. I tried to fathom the smell of hopelessness that seeped through, tainting our furniture and carpets and cushions, and the smell I brought back with me from 45N1, as if I had been visiting a temple where a mixture of loneliness and despair was burned in place of incense. One morning I saw that the nurse had collected my clothes and was checking them with the official list. "You're going to another ward," she said. My heart almost stopped. I felt my face grow pale. "Where?" "Oh, only next door. 45N1. I stood in the day room of 45N1. It was deserted except for a midget woman sitting sewing, her legs dangling from the battered leather sofa which with the other shabby furniture reminded me of the old-fashioned waiting room at Mr. Peters', our family dentist, and looking up at the walls I expected to see the familiar faded photograph of the club First 11, sitting with their legs and arms crossed, with the youthful clean-shaven Mr. Peters cradling the football between his knees and staring belligerently from the center of the front row. But there were no pictures or photographs on the wall. And gradually the characteristic ward smell, like something brewed in the floor and the walls and the furniture, leaked out and filled the room with such stifling force that had it been smoke there would have been cries of fire, fire, and attempts to escape from suffocation. But what warning do you cry for a smell that, as much as fire and smoke, has a capacity to destroy? The midget woman worked busily at her tablecloth, and I knew from the intricacy of the pattern and the care with which it was being followed, that this woman had been in hospital a long time. I had seen it before, at Cliffhaven, this needling of their whole life into a piece of fancy work, a dressing table cover, caddy, tablecloth, with no hope of ever seeing it in their own home, on their own furniture. They worked with the involvement and detachment of true artists. One could see how they cared for something that would be sold or given away and soiled into anonymity. They folded it neatly into the small bag where they kept their treasures. The midget woman had just such a small bag beside her. It held a magazine, knitting patterns, wool, needles, perhaps something to eat or a squashed chocolate at the bottom, or something to be picked up, that others might consider a trifle, but which she valued enough to keep and be unwilling, even roused to anger, if asked to discard. I stood alone by the door, near the piano with its lid up showing its unclean loose teeth wedged into gums of musty green baize, strengthening the impression suggested by the furniture, an obscenity of dental decay, waiting rooms, dreariness. I waited for the appearance of someone other than the midget woman. It occurred to me that in all my visits to 45N1 I had seen few patients belonging to the ward. Did they hide in burrows? Did they live in the wall and emerge only at mealtime? Or were they perpetually immured, and the smell that oozed from the ward was their personal smell of imprisonment that drained through their skin and their mind and their whole body? The day room door was not locked, yet I was afraid to move. I stood shivering in the corner, and tried to understand the meaning of being in 45N1. I dared not go outside in the garden and face the curious questions and glances of the privileged ward's 7 patients, nor could I go to the room where I was now to sleep, at the end of the corridor where ECT was given. I stood all afternoon in the sunless day room. Occasionally the midget woman gave a cluck of excitement when she concluded a rose or perfected a spray of leaves, and she held her embroidery at arm's length to get the general effect. Once I surprised her doing nothing, her work fallen as if she really did not care about it or were persuading herself not to care, her eyes staring with a grim expression and a frown on her face, which was freckled and aged, as is the way with midgets, when their features seemed to bear a double burden of time that would in normal growth be carried by their changing and developing body. Suddenly, from somewhere in the ward, the deep gong boomed again and immediately the whole ward seemed to come alive, as if the sound had disturbed the patients, like insects or flightless birds from their nests, and I saw people small, tall, fat, thin, deformed, mongoloid dwarfed appearing as if from nowhere from corners and hiding places, and with their little bags of treasures in their hands, hurrying and scurrying in obedience to the gong. I followed them. I arrived with them at the dining room and, following their example, queued outside the servery. I could see beyond the ward kitchen the TB wing and the dismal bare floors of its corridor, and a feeling of desolation overcame me. Nurses were shouting orders. People were being reprimanded. Everyone, plate in hand, was hastening to the table, triumphant in the knowledge of where to go and what to do. I burst into tears and fled from the room. I was fetched back forcibly by a nurse and sat at one of the tables, and my meal was put before me. The desolation flowed around me and through me and caught in my throat so that I could not make the movements necessary for eating food. I sat listening to the excited, irritated chatter of 45N1. I heard the words laundry, sewing room, and gossip connected with these, and guessed that 45N1 were the workers of the hospital. Their conversation was that of a people who had had an unaltered way of life for many years and who expected, indeed desired, that it should continue. I heard no one, as in Ward 7, talking of their families or their nervous breakdown and its symptoms. It was obvious that eccentricity was either not realized or else accepted as the way of life in the ward, and certainly not discussed. There seemed a haste, an urgency about everything, and tea was quickly finished and the knives counted, and there was a feeling in the air that the most important events of the day were about to occur. The dining room was quickly emptied. I noticed one of the patients who had left her bag behind come running back for it with panic in her eyes until she found it hadn't been stolen. A half-eaten apple rolled from the top. Swiftly she retrieved it, stuffing it into her bag. Then she went upstairs in the direction of the big dormitories where apparently most of the patients slept. Perhaps she would rummage around in her locker, arranging things, or, as was the habit of many of us, stand for a few moments beside her bed, as if affirming her claim to it. I tried to go along the corridor to visit my own room, touch the bed and walk from corner to corner, but I was told, day room. No one in the corridor until bedtime. I returned to the day room, which was beginning now to be crowded with people bustling in expectantly as if to attend an eventful rally. People sat busily sewing, knitting, quarreling, talking, occasionally glancing up and staring with eager anticipation at the door. A radio on a high-caged shelf, tuned to the local commercial station, let out a blare of singing commercials about toothpaste, razor blade soap. A nurse unlocked the radio and switched it off, and immediately there were complaints and loud cries of dissent. At intervals a patient fell to the floor in a fit. "It's Marjorie again," someone would say. Or Nancy. Or Pamela. And her bag would be guarded for her until she came to and reached out for it, confusedly exploring to see that nothing had been interfered with or stolen. And all evening the air of expectancy persisted. Whatever these people were waiting for, they were content to wait with little spurts of excitement at times when it seemed that the longed-for event was about to occur. Bedtime came. There was further fuss and flurry and eager adventurous progress along corridors and up staircases, high-pitched voices seeming unable to bear the excitement of knowing that surely whatever was going to happen would happen soon, soon. And if not tonight, why not tomorrow? Or the day after? I was ushered along the corridor and locked in my room, and my clothes tied by the sleeves of my cardigan and left outside the door, and sleep came in without knocking. The days passed. At mealtimes I sat at my place at the table, without eating, for the ward smell and the strangeness so overcame me and soaked into me that the food and the air and the people tasted of it. And the people, I knew now that they were automatons geared to a pitch of excitement they could not understand and fearful lest whatever or whoever controlled them should tire of giving them distraction, and let them run down like broken toys and have to find in their own selves a way of overcoming the desolation in which they lived. And after a month, and little food, I had grown so thin that I was put to bed, indefinitely, to rest, and I lay there apathetically, being fed rice and scrambled eggs. They thought I was ill. What would they have said if I had told them that illness can be caused by a smell, that it was the smell of 45N1 which was draining all my energy and desire to live? I could not escape from it, I was surrounded by it. And it could not seem to be that people lived in this way, like the patients of 45N1, crowded and lonely, unvisited, going sometimes in a bus or as a worker's privilege to a picnic, involved in their way of life as the only way they had known for years and would know now until they died. It could not seem to be that 45N1 opened onto the garden, sharing the birdbath and the weeping willow and the dropping roses with the gentle patients of Ward 7 who reclined in their bright, contemporary sitting room in gaily covered chairs and had delicious finically cooked meals, with cream and second helpings. I was not surprised when one of the 45N1 patients, Mrs. Jobson, who had evidently become separated from the sustaining concerted eagerness of the ward, jumped from the fire escape one day and killed herself. One morning, without my having suspected anything beforehand, I was given ECT. And when I woke I was given it again. When I saw the machine approaching for the second time I lost all control of myself in a culminating panic of screaming, and when I woke then, I saw the nurse arranging my clothes in a neat pile on the chair by the bed. "You're going to another ward," she told me. I was exhausted and not very curious, but I asked, "Where?" "Lone Lodge." When the nurse delivered me at the door of Lawn Lodge, she cautioned the nurse receiving me, "Watch out. She'll fly at you." I had never shown aggression. I had never flown at anyone. I had been only frightened, confused, and depressed, and my appetite had decayed at the mercy of the powerful ward smell, like fresh meat exposed to the sun and the flies. For it was true, the smell had been like the sun, in that the world of 45N1 revolved round it and drew from it a desolate kind of life, and the smell was like the flies, the way it sucked at the air and at our breaths and our clothes and the invisible apparel of our minds. And now I was in Lawn Lodge, the refractory ward, in a room full of raging, screaming, fighting people, 100 of them, many in soft straight jackets, others in long canvas jackets that fastened between the thighs, with the crossed arms laced at the back with stiff cord, and no way out for the hands. At one end of the long, dismal room was a heavy table, split and seamed with dirt, where about 16 people sat with one nurse to guide them. This was the special table, and the patients sitting here were not allowed to move from their places all day until they were driven along the corridor to bed. I was put at the special table next to Fiona, an ex-Borstal girl, who had had a brain operation and was wearing a soft jacket of ticking. "What do you think?" she said. She could not pronounce th. "What do you think? Once here you never get out." I watched from the special table, as from a seat in a concert hall, the raging mass of people performing their violent orchestration of unreason that seemed like a new kind of music of curse and cry, with the undertone of silence flowing from the quiet ones, the curled up, immovable and nameless, and the movement was a ballet, and the choreographer was insanity, and the whole room seemed like a microfilm of atoms in prison dress revolving and voyaging, if that were possible, in search of their lost nucleus. 2 patients attacked each other murderously. I was horrified to feel in myself the communal excitement that spread through the patients and the 3 nurses at the prospect of a tooth-and-claw battle. I was more horrified to see that, at times, the nurses tried to provoke the patients into displays of violence. They did this with Helen, who walked stiffly like a tin soldier, holding. Our sleeping quarters were divided into 2 downstairs dormitories, both locked, crowded with beds placed head to foot and side by side with scarcely room to undress. There were no lockers or any places to keep possessions, if we had been allowed any. For those who were thought to need them, there were single rooms along the corridor, downstairs, and upstairs, where there were also 2 open dormitories for the reliable patients. At first I slept in one of the locked dormitories, the foot of my bed reaching the head of Barbara's bed. Barbara did not sleep all night. She sat up in bed rubbing her hands together and giggling. Very soon, because of my habit of wandering in the night, I was transferred to a room along the corridor downstairs. In the morning, all patients from the dormitories and rooms were crowded into the tiny washroom to be dressed. There was little hope of washing, and as one entered the room one was bulldozed as it were by the smell of stale bodies. We stood there naked, packed tightly like cattle at the sale yards, and awaiting the random distribution of our clothes, which usually arrived with 1 or 2 until that day. How can we find our path and sleep in dreams, and preserve ourselves from the dangerous reality of lightning, snakes, traffic, germs, riot, earthquakes, blizzard, and dirt, when lice creep like riddles through our minds? Quick, where's the Red Cross God with the ointment and plaster, the needle and thread, and the clean linen bandages to mummify our festering dreams? Safety first. I will write about the season of peril. I was put in hospital because a great gap opened in the ice floe between myself and the other people whom I watched, with their world, drifting away through a violet-colored sea where hammerhead sharks in tropical ease swam side by side with the seals and the polar bears. I was alone on the ice. A blizzard came, and I grew numb, and wanted to lie down and sleep, and I would have done so had not the strangers arrived, with scissors and cloth bags filled with lice, and red-labeled bottles of poison, and other dangers which I had not realized before. Mirrors, cloaks, corridors, furniture, square inches, bolted lengths of silence, plain and patterned, free samples of voices. And the strangers, without speaking, put up circular calico tents and camped with me, surrounding me with their merchandise of peril. But I liked to eat caramel chocolate because I was lonely. I bought 12 cushions for 6 pence. I sat in the cemetery among the chrysanthemums, bunched in their brownish water inside slime-coated jam jars. I walked up and down in the dark city, following the gleaming tram lines that held and arrowed the streetlights and the trams, flashed sudden sparks above my head, and made it seem, with rainbow splashes of light, that I'd looked through tears. But the shop windows were speaking to me, and the rain too, running down inside the window of the fish shop, and the green moss and fern inside the florist's, and the dowdy, droopy two-piece sets in old-fashioned coats hung on the aged plaster models in the cheaper shops that could not afford to light their windows, and crowded their goods together, displayed with large warning tickets painted in red. They all spoke. They said, "Beware of the sale. Beware of bargain prices. Beware of traffic and germs. If you find a handkerchief, hold it up by the tip of the finger and thumb until it is claimed. For a cold in the chest, be steamed with friar's balsam. Do not sit on the seat of a public lavatory. Danger, power lines overhead." I was not yet civilized. I traded my safety for the glass beads of fantasy. They have said that we owe allegiance to safety, that he is our Red Cross who will provide us with ointment and bandages for our wounds and remove the foreign ideas, the glass beads of fantasy, the bent hairpins of unreason embedded in our minds. On all the doors which lead to and from the world, they have posted warning notices and lists of safety measures to be taken in extreme emergency. Lightning, isolation in the snows of the Antarctic, snakebite, riots, earthquakes. Never sleep in the snow. Hide the scissors. Beware of strangers. Lost in a foreign land, take your time from the sun and your position from the creeks flowing towards the sea. Don't struggle if you would be rescued from drowning. Suck the snakebite from the wound. When the earth opens and the chimneys topple, run out underneath the sky. But for the final day of destruction, when those that look from the windows shall be darkened, they have provided no slogan. The streets throng with people who panic, looking to the left and the right, covering the scissors, sucking poison from a wound they cannot find, judging their time from the sun's position in the sky, when the sun itself has melted and trickles down the ridges of darkness into the hollows of evaporated seas. They have said that we owe allegiance to safety, that he is our Red Cross who will provide us with ointment and bandages for our wounds, and remove the foreign ideas, the glass beads of fantasy, the bent hairpins of unreason embedded in our minds. On all the doors which lead to and from the world, they have posted warning notices and lists of safety measures to be taken in extreme emergency. Lightning, isolation in the snows of the Antarctic, snakebite, riots, earthquakes. Never sleep in the snow. Hide the scissors. Beware of strangers. Lost in a foreign land, take your time from the sun and your position from the creeks flowing towards the sea. Don't struggle if you would be rescued from drowning. Suck the snakebite from the wound. When the earth opens and the chimneys topple, run out underneath the sky. But for the final day of destruction, when those that look from the windows shall be darkened, they have provided no slogan. The streets throng with people who panic, looking to the left,